The moment Grayson Pembroke opened his mouth in front of 200 people, Audrey Bellamy knew she had been a fool. Not because she loved him, not even because she trusted him, because she had spent 3 years shrinking herself down to fit inside a life that was never going to be hers. He stood at that altar in his tailored ivory shirt, the one his mother had picked out, and he said the words with the calm of a man announcing a business decision. "I can't do this. She's not what our family needs." 200 guests. Phones already raised. His mother in the front row with an expression that looked almost like relief. And Audrey, in a dress that cost more than 3 months of her old salary, stood there and understood something that would take her months to fully accept. She had never actually been his choice. She had been his experiment. If this has ever happened to you, if someone you loved made you feel like a burden for simply existing, stay with me. Because what happened next will change how you think about dignity, revenge, and the kind of love that doesn't ask you to earn it. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story until the very end. You will not want to miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Audrey had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not from nerves, or not only from nerves. She had been awake because the apartment she shared with Grayson Pembroke on the 14th floor of a building she could never have afforded on her own was too quiet. And in that quiet, she kept hearing her mother's voice from 3 years ago, the night she first brought Grayson home. "He's a good man, Audrey. But those families, they're a different world." She had laughed it off. She was 24 then, freshly promoted at the marketing firm, certain that hard work and genuine love were the only currencies that mattered. 3 years of Constance Pembroke had taught her otherwise. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 7 that morning and tried to recognize herself. The hair was professionally done, Constance's stylist, Constance's appointment. The makeup was subtle and expensive, Constance's preference, not hers. Even the dress, ivory silk with a cathedral train, had been selected from a short list Constance approved. Audrey had told herself it didn't matter. She had told herself that once she and Grayson were married, the interference would stop. She would finally have a seat at the table instead of being evaluated for one. She believed that. She believed it right up until the moment she started walking down the aisle. The cathedral was exactly the kind of place Constance Pembroke loved: old stone, high ceilings, the faint smell of money and permanence. 200 guests filled the pews, most of them people Audrey had met at various events over the past 3 years and could identify by family name, but not by genuine memory. A handful of her own people were scattered near the back: her college roommate, Dana, her co-worker Marcus, her aunt from Cincinnati who had driven 8 hours for this. She could see them when she reached the midpoint of the aisle. Dana was already crying. Marcus was grinning. Her aunt had her hands pressed together and was mouthing something Audrey couldn't read. Audrey focused on Grayson. He was standing at the altar with his best man, a law school friend named Carter, who Audrey had always found slippery in ways she couldn't quite name. Grayson was dressed perfectly. He was always dressed perfectly. He had the kind of good looks that photographed well, and a smile that could convince you of almost anything. He wasn't smiling now. Audrey registered that, filed it somewhere in the back of her mind, and kept walking because the music was playing and 200 people were watching, and stopping seemed impossible. She reached the altar. The officiant began. And then Grayson turned to face her fully, and she saw something in his expression that she had never seen before. Not coldness exactly. Something worse. Resolution. "I'm sorry," he said. Not to the officiant, not to the room. To her, the music stopped. Someone in the pews made a sharp sound, a half-swallowed gasp. Audrey heard her own heartbeat. Grayson. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "What are you doing?" "I can't do this." He said it quietly, but the cathedral's acoustics carried every word to every corner of the room. "I'm sorry, Audrey. I can't marry you." The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then it detonated. She heard murmuring, shuffling, the soft percussion of 200 people reacting at once. She heard Constance Pembroke's voice, somewhere to her left, say something she couldn't make out. She heard Carter clear his throat with the careful neutrality of a man Who had known this was coming? Audrey stood very still. Why, it wasn't a question. She said it the way you say something when you already know you won't like the answer. Grayson looked at the floor for a moment, just for a moment, long enough for her to understand that whatever came next was rehearsed. You're not, he stopped. Tried again. My family needs someone who… Say it, her voice was quiet now, dangerously quiet. Say the actual words, Grayson. He looked up. His jaw was set. You're not what our family needs, Audrey. You never were. I'm sorry. I should have said this sooner. She heard phones, multiple phones, the soft mechanical sound of cameras capturing the exact second her life rearranged itself into before and after. From the front row, Constance Pembroke said nothing. She sat perfectly still, with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression arranged into something that was not quite sympathy and not quite satisfaction. Something precisely between the two. Audrey looked at her. Then she looked at Grayson. And she did something that she would later realize was the first genuinely proud thing she had done in 3 years. She didn't cry. Not yet, not in front of them. She turned around. She walked back down the aisle through the murmuring, through the phones, through her aunt's stricken face and Dana's open mouth, and Marcus already moving toward her from his pew, and she pushed through the cathedral doors into October air, so cold it felt like being slapped awake. The steps were stone and wide and old, the kind that had seen generations of people at their best and worst moments, without absorbing any of it. Audrey made it down 4 steps before her legs stopped working correctly. She sat down, right there on the cathedral steps, in Constance Pembroke's approved dress, with the train spreading out around her like something wounded. And then the tears came, because she was alone for approximately 45 seconds, before Dana burst through the doors, and 45 seconds was long enough. She had loved him. She needed to be clear about that, at least to herself. This wasn't just wounded pride. She had actually loved Grayson Pembroke, the version of him that existed in private moments, cooking badly in their kitchen at midnight, reading beside her on Sunday mornings, telling her things about his childhood that she suspected he'd never told anyone. She had loved that man. She was no longer sure that man had ever entirely existed. Dana sat down beside her without saying anything, which was exactly right. Marcus appeared on her other side 30 seconds later and put his arm around her shoulders, and that was exactly right, too. She was going to have to leave the apartment. Grayson owned it, his family's building. She had 30 days, probably, before that conversation became unavoidable. She had $11,000 in her savings account. She had a law school acceptance letter she'd been keeping secret because she hadn't known how to tell Grayson she was thinking about going back to school. She'd thought maybe after the wedding, after things settled. She had a dress that cost $4,000 and currently had a small tear in the hem from the cathedral steps. She was 27 years old, and she had just been publicly humiliated in front of 200 people and an unknown number of smartphone cameras, and she had absolutely no idea what came next. That was the precise moment she became aware of a shadow on the steps above her. She didn't look up immediately. She assumed it was another guest, some Pembroke family connection coming to offer condolences that were really just curiosity wearing a polite face. Miss Bellamy. The voice was not what she expected. She looked up. The man standing 3 steps above her was not a wedding guest she recognized. He was tall, not exceptionally so, but tall enough that the way he stood made him seem like he occupied more physical space than his actual dimensions accounted for. Dark brown hair, steel gray eyes, a suit that was not expensive in any way she could immediately identify, but that somehow communicated more authority than anything Grayson had ever worn. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not pity, not satisfaction. Something more clinical and more human, at the same time the expression of someone who has seen a great deal of damage and hasn't yet decided what to do about this particular instance of it. I don't know you, she said. No. He sat down on the step above hers, which was an odd thing to do, but he did it with the ease of someone who had decided the social geometry of the situation and arranged it to his preference. My name is Damon Vercetti. Dana and Marcus had both gone still. Audrey didn't recognize the name. Later, she would understand that this itself was insert significant. Damon Vercetti was a name you either knew immediately or had been specifically kept away from. "What do you want?" she asked. Her voice was still steadier than she felt. It was doing that on its own now, some survival mechanism she hadn't known she had. "I was here for the same event you were," he said. "Different reasons. You know the Pembrokes. The Pembrokes owe me $7 million. He said it, the way you'd say the Pembrokes owe me a phone call matter-of-factly, without particular heat. A failed development deal. I've been patient about it." Audrey stared at him. "And you're telling me this because I have a proposition for you." He paused. "And I want to be clear up front that you can tell me to go to hell." "That's a completely reasonable response." Dana made a small sound beside her. Marcus's arm had gone rigid. Audrey looked at this stranger on the cathedral steps and thought, "This is the strangest day of my life, and it is apparently not finished." What kind of proposition? He did not lay it out quickly. She would realize later that this was deliberate. Damon Vercetti was not a man who rushed anything important. He spoke with the measured pace of someone accustomed to explaining things once and not twice, and he watched her face as he talked the way a person watches a document they're reading, rather than a performance they're watching. He wanted to get married, he said, not because he was lonely or in love or any of the usual reasons. He needed a wife for reasons that were specific to his business and his current position in Chicago's social and legal landscape. He needed someone incredible, someone sharp, and someone with a very particular motivation. The Pembrokes had just handed him a candidate with all three qualities. In return, and this was the part he took his time on, he would provide Audrey with full legal representation during negotiations. A marriage contract, prepared by an independent attorney of her choosing. Complete financial coverage of her law school education. A living allowance that would give her independence from any job or family connection. Separate accommodations, no physical expectations. No interference with her education or her life. And if she chose to leave at the end of 12 months, she would leave with enough money to start entirely fresh. The catch, he said, was that the Pembrokes would know about it immediately. That was the point. The woman they had just publicly discarded would be introduced to Chicago as Mrs. Audrey Vercetti before 48 hours had passed. Audrey sat on the cathedral steps in her torn dress and listened to all of this. "You're describing a business transaction," she said when he finished. "Yes. Using me as a weapon against people who just humiliated me. Also yes. And you think I should do this because I don't think you should do anything." He said it flatly, without apology. "I'm offering you an option. You have others. I'm not pretending this is your only path." He paused. "But it is the one where Constance Pembroke watches the woman she spent 3 years trying to diminish walk back into every room she's ever been in as my wife. And I've seen how that woman operates, Miss Bellamy. She will not recover from that quickly." Silence. Dana grabbed Audrey's hand. "Hard, Audrey," Dana said. "Low and urgent. Can I just—" "Give us a minute," Audrey said. Dana looked at her. Then at Damon. Then back at Audrey. "I'll be right there," Audrey said. "I promise." Dana stood up, pulling Marcus with her by the arm, and they retreated to the top of the steps with the practiced reluctance of people who desperately want to stay. Audrey looked at Damon Vercetti. "Your business," she said. "Tell me what it actually is." Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, development, real estate, investments. He held her gaze and other things. "What other things?" A pause, the kind that has weight to it. "Things that are managed carefully," he said. "Things that you would not be involved in, required to participate in, or expected to ignore. If you want specifics, my attorney can walk you through what you will and won't have exposure to under the contract." It was not a complete answer. She knew that. He knew that she knew it. "Are you dangerous?" she asked. "To you?" He shook his head once. "No, to other people." Another pause. Shorter this time. "I can be." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the cathedral doors, still slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see the edge of the front pew and one of Constance Pembroke's gloved hands resting on it. She thought about 3 years of etiquette lessons she hadn't asked for. 3 years of subtle corrections, her accent, Her table manners, her clothing, her opinions about things that were apparently not the right opinions. 3 years of social gatherings where she was introduced last, and introduced carefully, as though Grayson was managing his family's reaction to her rather than bringing her into his life. She thought about the law school acceptance letter sitting in the bottom drawer of the desk in their apartment. The apartment she had 30 days to leave. She thought about $11,000 and no plan. She looked at Damon Vercetti, who had not looked away from her once, and who had not offered her a single piece of false comfort, or a single word designed to manipulate her emotions, which was already more honesty than Grayson had given her in the last year of their relationship. She stood up from the cathedral steps. Her dress tore a little more at the hem. She didn't look down. 1 year, she said, he stood as well. At full height, the difference between them was significant, but his posture had nothing aggressive in it. He simply stood the way a person stands when they're accustomed to not needing to perform confidence. 1 year, he confirmed. I want my own attorney. Not yours. That's the requirement, not the exception. I want full transparency on what I'm walking into. You'll have it, and if I find out you've lied to me about anything, the contract will specify exactly what constitutes grounds for immediate termination of the arrangement, full financial release, and my legal obligation not to interfere with anything you do afterward. He said it without hesitation, which told her it wasn't something he was making up on the steps. He had thought about this. I don't lie to people I make agreements with, Miss Bellamy. It's bad business. She looked at him for one more second. Then she extended her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief and completely businesslike, which was somehow the most reassuring thing about all of it. I'll need to get my things, she said. My car is at the corner. Take whatever time you need. She turned and walked up the steps toward Dana and Marcus, who were watching her with the expressions of two people watching someone they love, walk towards something they can't evaluate. Audrey, Dana started. I know, Audrey said, do you? Because that man... I know, she took Dana's hands in both of hers. I'm not okay right now. I'm not going to pretend I am. But I'm also not going to stand here for the next 6 hours, being the woman Grayson Pembroke abandoned at the altar, and right now that's the only thing I know for certain. She squeezed Dana's hands. Call me tonight? I'll explain everything I can. Dana looked like she wanted to say 12 more things. She said one. Be careful, I will. The photographs started appearing within 2 hours. Audrey didn't see them directly. She was in the back of Damon's car, being driven to a firm on Michigan Avenue, where an attorney named Marjorie Keene was apparently waiting on a Saturday afternoon, which told Audrey something specific about how seriously Damon Vercetti operated, but Dana texted her a link with 3 question marks attached. The image was taken from across the street at a slight upward angle, probably a phone camera with good zoom. It showed Audrey dress torn, tear tracks she hadn't known were visible, spine straight, taking the hand of a dark-haired man in a gray suit beside a black car. The caption someone had added read, Pembroke wedding fail and the mystery man. There were already 400 comments. She put the phone face down on the seat. Marjorie Keene turned out to be a woman, in her late 50s with reading glasses, pushed up on her head, and the manner of someone who had heard every variety of human disaster and catalogued them efficiently. She met Audrey without Damon present. He had gone to a separate room, without being asked, and she spent 40 minutes walking Audrey through a document that was, she noted with a kind of professional appreciation, genuinely thorough. Your education is fully covered. Tuition, fees, materials, housing stipend indexed to Chicago cost of living. Marjorie tapped a section. Your monthly allowance is separate and non-negotiable. It doesn't decrease if the relationship deteriorates. Your physical privacy is absolute and legally enforceable. Your right to terminate the arrangement with 30 days' notice is guaranteed at any point, for any reason. She looked at Audrey over the glasses that had slipped back down her nose. The penalties for breach on his side are substantial. What does he get out of it? Audrey asked. A wife on public record. Access to certain social contexts that are easier to navigate with a spouse. And Marjorie paused in a way that was clearly intentional. Leverage against a specific family who owe him a significant sum. The contract Doesn't name them, but that whoever they are, appearing at events with you will cause them considerable discomfort. Audrey absorbed that. If I sign this, she said, I'm agreeing to be used. You're agreeing to a mutually beneficial arrangement with clearly defined terms and robust protections. Marjorie set the document down. Whether that constitutes being used is a philosophical question I can't answer for you. What I can tell you is that legally, you are extremely well protected. Better protected than most people in conventional marriages, frankly. Audrey looked at the document. She thought about Grayson. She thought about what it meant that somewhere in Chicago right now, Constance Pembroke was either managing a scandal or sitting very comfortably in the knowledge that Audrey had disappeared quietly back into the city with nothing. She picked up the pen. There's one thing I want added, she said. Marjorie raised an eyebrow. No lies. I want an explicit clause if he lies to me about anything material to this arrangement. I can walk with full settlement. No waiting period. Marjorie was quiet for a moment. Then she wrote it down. I'll present it to his attorney. Give me 20 minutes. It took 12. The amendment came back approved without negotiation. Audrey signed. They were legally married in a county clerk's office the following morning with Marjorie and one of Damon's men as witnesses. The whole thing took 11 minutes. There were no flowers, no music, no cathedral acoustics, no 200 guests. Audrey wore jeans and a dark green sweater that was hers. Actually hers, bought with her own money from a store. Constance had once described as serviceable. She had slept in the guest suite of Damon's penthouse, a room with its own entrance from the hallway, its own bathroom, its own lock, and she had slept, against all odds, for 7 solid hours. When she woke up, her phone had 47 missed calls, 19 of them from Grayson, 11 from a number she identified as belonging to the Pembroke family attorney, and 4 from her aunt in Cincinnati, who had left voice messages that ranged from, "Are you alive to call me immediately?" to something that sounded like both. She called her aunt first. "I'm fine," she said before her aunt could start. "I'm really fine. I'll explain everything soon. I promise." Audrey Marie Bellamy, Aunt Rose. "I'm fine. I made a decision. It might be the strangest decision I've ever made, but it's mine, and I'm okay." A pause. "I have to go get married in 45 minutes. I'll call you after." She hung up before her aunt could fully recover. Damon was waiting in the kitchen when she came downstairs at a counter with coffee and what appeared to be a completely serious attempt at making breakfast, evidenced by a pan on the stove and several eggs that had not yet been broken, and the particular focused expression of someone who cooks infrequently and takes it seriously when they do. She stopped in the doorway. "You cook?" she said. He looked up. "Attempt to. You take anything in your coffee?" "Milk. No sugar." He nodded and moved to the coffee maker, and she sat at the counter and tried to locate her own equilibrium in a kitchen that probably cost more than her childhood home. "Did you sleep?" he asked. Surprisingly, yes, she accepted the coffee. "You?" "Enough." He turned back to the eggs. "I have a press statement going out at 9. Announcement of our marriage. Straightforward, no editorializing. You'll want to read it before it goes. Yes, there'll be coverage. Some of it will be ugly. Mostly, it'll be speculation about why Grayson's abandoned fiancée married me within 24 hours. Let them speculate." He glanced at her. "You're sure? What's the alternative? Explain myself to people who have already decided what they think." She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. "I've spent 3 years explaining myself to Constance Pembroke and her circle. I'm done explaining." He looked at her for a moment with that evaluating expression she was starting to recognize, the one that wasn't cold and wasn't warm, just attentive in a way that felt like being actually looked at rather than assessed for value. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. The eggs turned out slightly overcooked. Neither of them mentioned it. The press statement went out at 9:15. By noon, every Chicago society and gossip outlet had picked it up. By 2, it had reached national entertainment news. By 4, Audrey Bellamy, 27 years old, working-class Chicago girl, publicly abandoned at the altar by the Pembroke heir on a Saturday morning, was trending, and so was the name Damon Vercetti, and so was the phrase "married the same day." Audrey read the coverage from the desk in her suite, with Dana on video call, and felt something strange move through her that took her a moment to identify. Not satisfaction, not yet. Something more preliminary than that. It felt like the beginning of being taken seriously. Okay, Dana said from the phone screen. Okay, I looked him up. I looked up everything I could find. And he's real. The development stuff is real. He's got major projects all over the city, some nationally. He's been investigated twice by the FBI, nothing charged. Dana's voice was careful. Audrey, the rumors about him are not small. I know. Do you? He told me himself that he can be dangerous. She kept her voice level. He didn't lie about it. That's not exactly reassuring. No, but it's honest, which puts him ahead of the man I was going to marry yesterday. She looked out the window at Chicago spread below her. I have a contract, Dana. A real one. I have a lawyer. I have an exit clause. I have more financial protection right now than I've had at any point in the last 3 years. Dana was quiet for a moment. Is he decent to you? She finally asked. Audrey thought about overcooked eggs and coffee, with milk and no sugar and a press statement he had let her read before it went out. So far, she said, yeah, okay. Dana took a breath. Okay. You call me if anything. You'll be the first call I make. I promise. She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't have saved, but the message started. With "This is Grayson," and she deleted it without reading the rest. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in October, brutal and bright, and absolutely indifferent to the personal disasters of the people living inside it. Audrey opened her laptop and pulled up the law school enrollment portal. She had a spring semester to register for. She had a year to figure out the rest. And somewhere in the city that was currently speculating about her choices, Constance Pembroke had just seen the name Audrey Vercetti on a press release. It was, Audrey thought, a reasonable beginning. 3 days into her marriage to Damon Vercetti, Audrey learned 2 things about him that no press release would ever mention. The first was that he was up before 5 every morning without exception. Not because he couldn't sleep, because he chose not to. She figured this out on day 2 when she woke, at 4:45 with a dry throat, and padded down to the kitchen and found him already at the long dining table with a cup of coffee and a stack of documents, dressed like he was going somewhere, reading with the concentrated stillness of a man who did not experience the early hours as punishment. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Coffee's fresh," he said, and looked back at his documents. She made coffee and took it back to her room and lay awake for another hour thinking about what kind of person voluntarily wakes up before sunrise every day of their life and finds as that normal. The second thing she learned was that the people around him were afraid of him in a way that was not performative. She had expected something theatrical men who flinched visibly, who spoke in careful sentences, who watched the door. What she got instead was subtler and more instructive. His staff moved with a kind of precise, self-erasing efficiency. His drivers confirmed routes without being asked twice. His assistant, a compact man in his 40s named Ferris, answered questions before they were fully articulated and never, not once in 3 days, made eye contact with Audrey unless she initiated it directly. It was the fear of people who had learned that competence was the only reliable protection. Audrey filed all of this and said nothing and registered for her first semester of law school and spent the rest of the week learning the geography of a life she had agreed to inhabit for 12 months. Then Constance Pembroke sent a letter. It arrived on a Thursday, addressed to her by her new name, Mrs. Audrey Vercetti in Constance's handwriting, which Audrey recognized from 3 years of thank you notes she'd been coached to write. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first expressed concern for Audrey's well-being in the context of her impulsive decision. The second suggested that Audrey must surely understand that Grayson's choice had been difficult for him as well, and that his family remained open to a private conversation. The third paragraph was the one that mattered. It suggested, delicately, that a quiet annulment might be arranged with minimal public attention, and that the Pembroke family would be willing to assist with Audrey's future education and housing needs in exchange for her cooperation. Audrey read it twice, then she walked it down to Damon's office, the one on the 3rd floor of the penthouse that she had not entered before, and knocked. "Come in." He was on the phone. He held up one finger without looking at her, finished 2 sentences, and ended the call. She put the letter on his desk. He read it. His expression didn't change in any way that most people would have clocked. But something around his jaw did something brief and controlled. "She's trying to buy you out," he said. "She's trying to make this go away before it costs her anything." "Yeah." He set the letter down. "What do you want to do with it?" "Nothing." Audrey picked it back up. "I want her to wait for an answer that never comes. That's all." He looked at her for a moment. "Okay." She turned to leave. "Audrey." She stopped. "There's an event Saturday night. Political fundraiser. People I need to be seen at. The Pembrokes will be there." He said it without apology. "It's your call whether you come." She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "What time?" The event was at the kind of venue that had been renovated 4 times in the last century, and each renovation had added another layer of deliberate grandeur, until the cumulative effect was something that communicated money so aggressively it had circled back around to feeling almost sincere. Audrey wore a dress. She had chosen herself dark blue, structured, not the kind of thing Constance would have approved of, which was precisely why she bought it. She had done her own hair, her own makeup. She looked like herself, which was something she was relearning how to be. Damon met her at the elevator. He took in the dress without commentary, which she appreciated. He said ready, not as a question, but as an offering something she could decline if she needed to. "Ready," she said. They walked in together. She felt the shift in the room the moment they crossed the threshold. Not a wave, not a ripple, more like a pressure change. The specific social adjustment of 200 people simultaneously recalibrating who was standing where and what it meant. Damon's hand was at the small of her back, light enough to be optional, present enough to be legible. She saw Grayson first. He was near the bar with Carter and 2 men she didn't know, and he saw her at almost the same moment and went very still in the way that people go still when they see something they were not prepared for. She looked at him for exactly long enough to make it intentional. Then she looked away. Constance found them in 12 minutes. Audrey had expected hostility. She had prepared for a particular kind of polished social aggression. Yes. The type Constance had perfected over decades, the kind that left you bleeding without anyone in the room being able to identify the wound. What she had not prepared for was Constance walking up to Damon with an expression that was somewhere between controlled fury and something older and more animal. Something that recognized a different kind of threat than the ones she usually managed. "Damon." Constance's voice was exactly what it always was, crisp, precise, every syllable doing exactly the work she assigned it. "I wasn't aware you'd be attending, Constance." He said her name the way you say a street name, informational, no warmth, no hostility. "Just location, you look well." Her eyes moved to Audrey. The assessment happened in under 2 seconds and was thorough and damaging and entirely silent. "Audrey," she said, "this is..." A pause that was engineered to carry weight. "Surprising, is it?" Audrey said, "given the circumstances." Given how quickly Constance. Damon's voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen. It simply became the only sound in the immediate vicinity that mattered. "You owe Audrey an apology. 3 years of them if we're being specific. But let's start with one." Constance's chin came up. "I beg your pardon. $7 million, he said. "We can talk about that instead, if you prefer." The color in Constance's face did something complicated. She had the practiced complexion control of someone who had managed difficult conversations in public for 40 years, and even she couldn't hold it completely. "This isn't the place. You made your choice about place and time at the cathedral last Saturday," Damon said. 200 guests. Phone cameras. Whatever your son felt about the relationship, the way it ended was a performance. You produced that performance. He tilted his head almost imperceptibly. "So the apology, or the conversation about the debt?" "Your choice. Both of them happened tonight." The room had not gone silent. There was music, there was the peripheral conversation of a crowd, but the 4 feet of space around the 3 of them had developed its own quality of stillness. Audrey stood very still and waited, and did not allow herself to want it too, obviously. Constance Pembroke stood there for 7 seconds. Audrey counted. 7 seconds of calculation and fury, and something that might have been the first genuine fear the woman had experienced in years. Then she looked at Audrey. "I owe you an apology." She said it the way a person says something they have physically extracted from themselves. For the way Saturday was handled, and for fractional pause. For certain things over the past 3 years that were unnecessarily unkind. It was not complete. It was not warm. It was barely sufficient. But Constance Pembroke had said it in public, in front of people who mattered to her, with Damon Vercetti standing 18 inches away. Audrey nodded once. "Thank you." Constance walked away at a pace that was controlled enough to appear unhurried and quick enough to be a retreat. Audrey exhaled through her nose, slow and careful. "You okay?" Damon asked. Quiet, close enough that it wasn't for the room. "Ask me in an hour," she said. He almost smiled. She clocked it in her peripheral vision, the slight movement at the corner of his mouth that never completed itself. "Fair," he said. Grayson found her 40 minutes later. She hadst away from Damon, intentionally, needing air and space and 30 seconds of being nobody's anything. And she was standing near a window with a glass of water when she heard his voice. "Audrey," she turned. He looked like he hadn't slept. That was the first thing she noticed, and she noted with some exhausted part of herself that she still noticed. She probably always would. 3 years left marks even when you were finished with them. "Grayson, can we—" He glanced around. "Can we just talk?" "For 5 minutes. We're talking." He moved closer. She didn't step back, not because she wanted to hold ground theatrically, but stepping back required energy she didn't have. "I need you to understand what happened," he said. "I understand what happened." "No, Audrey, you don't." "My mother," he stopped. Ran a hand through his hair in the gesture she had once found endearing and now read as the self-management ticket actually was. "She told me she would cut me off entirely. The trust, the company position, everything. If I went through with marrying you." She looked at him. "She threatened me for months," he said. "I kept thinking I could find another way. I kept thinking I don't know, that I'd figure it out. And then the morning of the wedding He shook his head. "I panicked. I didn't know how to tell you privately, so I found You announced it to 200 people." "I know," his voice cracked on it. "Not performed." She could tell the difference after 3 years. "I know, and I've been trying to figure out how to—" "Grayson." She kept her voice level. "I hear what you're saying. I believe that you believe your explanation is adequate. But I need you to understand something." She held his gaze. "You chose not to fight for me. That's not something your mother did. That's something you did. She threatened, you decided. And the fact that you made that decision in front of 200 people with phone cameras running is something I'm going to be living with for a very long time. And you don't get to come find me at a party and fix that with 5 minutes of explanation." He stared at her. "I loved you," he said, low, stripped of everything rehearsed. "I know you did." She picked up her water glass. "Enough to date me for 3 years. Not enough to marry me when it cost you something." She looked at him one last time. "I hope the West Coast position works out for you." "I mean that." She walked away before he could respond. Her hands were not entirely steady. She found a quiet corner near the coat check and stood there for a moment with her back to the room and breathed like her chest was trying to recalibrate. "You handled that better than most people would have." She turned. Damon was there, not close enough to be intrusive, standing with the relaxed vigilance of someone who had been tracking her position across the room without making it obvious. "Were you watching?" "I was close by." He said it without apology. "I wasn't going to step in unless you needed it." "I didn't." "No, you didn't." He paused. "You want to leave?" She thought about it. She thought about Constance's forced apology, and Grayson's cracked voice, and the particular weight of being in a room full of people who were all working out their own story about who she was and what she represented. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, I want to leave." In the car, in the dark, she said something she hadn't planned to say. "He told me Constance threatened to cut him off if he married me." Damon didn't respond immediately. He was looking out his window at Chicago moving past. "I believe it," he said finally. "I believe it too." She stared at her own hands in her lap. "It doesn't change anything. I know that. But it makes him—" She searched for the word. "Smaller." It makes him smaller than I thought he was, which is worse than him being larger and cruel. Why worse? Because if he was just cruel, I could be angry. But he was just scared. She pressed her fingers together. I was with a man for 3 years who was too scared of his own mother to fight for me, and I didn't see it. You saw what he showed you. I saw what I wanted to see. Damon turned from the window and looked at her. That's not stupidity, he said. That's just being human. You trusted someone who didn't deserve it. That happens to people. She looked at him. You sound like you know. Something shifted in his expression. Brief. Contained. The kind of shift that happens when a question lands somewhere the person wasn't expecting it. Yeah, he said, I know. He didn't elaborate. She didn't push. But something in the car's atmosphere changed slightly, like a small door had been cracked open and then left to swing on its own. They rode the rest of the way in silence that felt, for the first time, like something more than just the absence of conversation. 2 weeks later, Audrey started law school. She had expected it to feel like relief. What it felt like was vertigo, the specific disorientation of being in a room where nobody knew who Damon Vercetti was, where nobody was watching her for signs of scandal or motivation, or the specific kind of performance that public marriages required, where she was simply a first-year student with a laptop and a backpack and a seat 3 rows from the front. She was the oldest in most of her classes by 2 or 3 years, which should have bothered her, and mostly didn't. The coursework hit her like cold water specific, demanding, uninterested in anything except whether she could think clearly and argue precisely. She was good at it. She was surprised by how immediately and unmistakably good at it she was. Her contracts professor, a dry and meticulous woman named Dr. Hart, stopped her after the second class. Your analysis of the promissory estoppel question was the clearest in the room, she said. Have you had any legal background? No. Audrey adjusted her bag strap. She almost said read a lot of contracts lately. I've been paying attention to language for a long time. Dr. Harte looked at her with the brisk evaluation of someone who graded people on precision. Good. Keep doing that. She texted Dana from the hallway outside. I think I might actually be okay at this, Dana replied. In 40 seconds. I know. Also, you're trending again. Don't look, just wanted to warn you. Audrey looked. A journalist loosely used, it was a Chicago Society blog, with high traffic, had published a piece titled Vercetti Bride, Victim, Accomplice, or Genius, with a photo of her and Damon entering the fundraiser. She read the first paragraph and closed the tab. She had a property law, reading due Thursday, and a contracts outline to start, and she had spent 3 years worrying about how the Pembroke family's social circle perceived her, and she was done. She was categorically, completely, and permanently done. Damon started asking about her classes. This was not what she'd expected. She had prepared herself for polite coexistence, mutual respect, separate routines, the courteous distance of 2 adults sharing an arrangement that served them both. She had not prepared for the thing that actually happened, which was that Damon Vercetti, who controlled gambling networks and owned half a city block and made experienced federal investigators nervous, turned out to be genuinely curious about contract law. Walk me through it, he said one evening. She had her textbook open at the kitchen counter, and he had stopped on his way through from his office. The consideration doctrine, the whole thing. Why does it matter? She looked at him. He pulled out the stool across from her and sat down with the posture of someone actually settling in for information. She walked him through it. She expected him to lose interest in 4 minutes. He asked questions that were specific and structurally intelligent for another 25. Not because he was performing engagement. He had no reason to perform anything for her benefit at this point. But because the way his mind worked, she was beginning to understand, was oriented toward systems. How things were built. Where the leverage points were. Contract law was, at its core, the architecture of agreements and their failure points, and that happened to a subject Damon Vercetti had spent 20 years studying in an entirely different curriculum. You would have been a good lawyer, she said, and meant it without flattery. I would have been a terrible lawyer, he said. I have no patience for the process. I just like knowing how the structure works. That's most of what law school actually is. Then you're in the right place. She looked at him across the textbook. Why did you come to the wedding? She asked specifically. You could have approached the Pembrokes about the debt through attorneys. His expression didn't shift, but he picked up his coffee mug and held it without drinking from it, which she had learned meant he was selecting his words. I was going to, he said. I'd had conversations with their attorneys for 6 months. They were stalling Constance specifically, stringing out the process while she quietly moved assets around. He set the mug down. I went to the wedding to let Grayson see my face, to let him understand that the stalling had an end point. And then he canceled the wedding instead. And then he canceled the wedding. He paused. And you came out of those doors and He stopped. She waited. I made a decision, he said. Not entirely the calculated one I told you it was. The kitchen was very quiet. What was the other part? She asked. He looked at her steadily. I was angry on your behalf. Before I knew you at all, I saw what he did to you in that room. And I was angry. He said it flatly without apparent embarrassment. That's not a useful emotion, and it's not how I usually operate. But it was there. Audrey absorbed that. That's the most human thing you've said to me, she said. I have my moments, he said, and picked up his coffee, and she laughed, actually laughed. Short, it's precise and real, and something in his expression did the thing it almost never fully did. He smiled. Not the controlled, not quite smile she'd clocked at the fundraiser. An actual one, brief and unguarded and clearly unfamiliar to his own face. It disappeared quickly, but it had been there. Ferris came to her on a Wednesday. She was in the small study off the main hallway, reading cases on her laptop, and Ferris appeared in the doorway with the careful neutrality he wore as a professional obligation. Mrs. Vercetti. Ferris. She had stopped asking him to use her first name. He was constitutionally incapable of it. What's going on? Mr. Vercetti wanted me to let you know that there may be some additional press attention over the next several days. A pause. Relating to a business matter. She put her laptop down. What kind of business matter? Ferris's neutrality became slightly more effortful. I'm not entirely at liberty, Ferris. She kept her voice even. My name is on a marriage certificate with that man. If something is coming that affects our public situation, I need to know what it is. Not the details, just the shape of it. He looked at her for a moment. He made a decision that she suspected was slightly outside his usual operational parameters. There's a federal inquiry, he said, preliminary, into certain investment structures connected to Mr. Vercetti's development portfolio. He paused. His attorneys are managing it. It is not at this stage something that implicates you in any way. She sat very still. How long has this been in motion? Several months. Before our marriage. Yes. She breathed through her nose. Carefully. Thank you, Ferris. He nodded and withdrew with the efficiency of someone who had just exceeded his usual professional territory and wanted to retreat back into it cleanly. Audrey closed her laptop. She sat for a moment. Then she stood up and walked upstairs to Damon's office and knocked. Come in. He looked up from his desk. He registered her expression and set down what he was holding. Ferris told you, he said. Ferris mentioned there was a federal inquiry. She came into the room and stood across the desk from him. You didn't. The silence had a different quality than their usual ones. It started before the wedding, he said. Before I approached you. It's preliminary. My attorneys are... I know what Ferris told me. Her voice was controlled and careful, and she was working to keep it that way, because the alternative was anger, and the anger felt large, and she needed to think clearly first. I need to know why you didn't tell me. The contract says, the contract prohibits lying to you about anything material to the arrangement. He met her gaze. I didn't lie to you. I didn't tell you. Those aren't the same thing. In spirit they are. Maybe. He didn't look away. I didn't tell you because I didn't want it to affect your decision to sign. And because by the time you signed, the inquiry was already a week old and no closer to anything concrete, and my attorneys told me it would likely go nowhere. A pause. They still think that. That's not the point. I know it's not the point. The point is that I asked for no lies, and you gave me the narrowest possible technical definition of that and used it. He sat back in his chair. He had the expression of a person absorbing something without arguing it, which she had not expected. which made her slightly more angry in a way she couldn't immediately explain. "You're right," he said. She blinked. That was the wrong call. He said it without performance. "I made it anyway. I'm not going to pretend I had no choice, because I did. I chose not to tell you because I wanted you to sign the contract, and that choice was more about what I wanted than what you were owed." He paused. "I'm telling you now because you found out, but I'm also telling you because you deserve the honest version." Audrey stood there. The anger was still there, but something about the way he delivered, that no deflection, no minimizing, no managing of her reaction, made it harder to sustain at full temperature. "If this inquiry goes somewhere real," she said, "I need to know immediately. Not from Ferris. From you. Yes. And anything else that's been managed carefully and not mentioned." His jaw moved slightly. "There are things about my operations that are complex, and some of them are legally ambiguous." "I'm in law school," she said. "I can handle complex and legally ambiguous." Something moved through his expression. She couldn't name it precisely. Something between reluctant respect and a problem he hadn't finished solving yet. "I'll have my attorney set up a full briefing," he said. "This week. Thank you." She turned to leave. "Audrey." She stopped in the doorway. "If you want to use the 30-day exit clause, I'll understand." She stood there with her hand on the doorframe. She thought about Marjorie Keene and 40 pages of protection and an exit clause she had negotiated herself. She thought about the look on Constance Pembroke's face when she was forced to apologize. She thought about law school and contract law and a contracts professor who'd said, "Keep doing that." She thought about overcooked eggs and an actual smile that had lasted 3 seconds and disappeared. "I'll let you know," she said. She walked back to her study and opened her laptop and tried to read a case about promissory estoppel and read the same paragraph 4 times before she put her head down on the desk and breathed. She was angry. She was also, and this was the part she couldn't rationalize away, not leaving. She was aware that the distance between those two things was closing in ways she hadn't budgeted for. The Pembrokes filed their lawsuit on a Friday morning. Audrey was in the middle of a contracts lecture when her phone buzzed with a text from Marjorie Keene. "Call me as soon as you're out." The lecture took another 40 minutes. She sat through it with the phone face down and her pen moving across her notes and her mind entirely elsewhere. Outside in the hallway, she called Marjorie back. "They've filed a civil suit," Marjorie said. "Fraud and defamation. They're claiming your marriage is a constructed scheme to damage their reputation and manipulate the outstanding debt." Audrey leaned against the hallway wall. "The timing," she said. "Exactly. They're claiming the marriage was designed from the beginning to embarrass Grayson and cursory payment through social pressure." Marjorie's voice was the voice of someone who had been expecting this and had already started running calculations. "It's not a strong case, but it's a public. They're going to try to make the contract itself, the evidence, the separate bedrooms clause, the financial arrangement, the speed of the marriage. Everything that looks transactional looks like conspiracy when you frame it right. What do we need to do? You need to talk to Damon." A pause. "And you both need to start behaving like people who are actually married. Consistently. In public and in places the Pembrokes' investigators can document." Another pause. "I'm sorry to be clinical about this. You're being a lawyer," Audrey said. "That's what I need right now." She hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment, with students moving past her on both sides, laughing and talking and carrying the ordinary weight of ordinary days. She called Damon. He picked up on the second ring. "I heard," he said. "Marjorie says we need to—" "I know what Marjorie says." His voice was measured. "Come home when you're done. We'll figure it out." She stared at the wall across the hallway. "Come home." He'd said it without, apparently, noticing the word choice. She wasn't sure she was ready to notice it either. "Okay," she said. "I'll be there by 4. She went back into the building, to her next class, and sat down, and opened her notebook, and wrote a date at the top of the page. Everything that had started as a 12-month arrangement with a clear exit strategy had just become something that could not be exited cleanly. The lawsuit changed the geometry of everything what they owed each other, what their agreement meant. The next several months would require of both of them in terms of proximity and presence, and the performance of something they had explicitly agreed not to perform, or what had started as performance. She wasn't entirely sure anymore when it had started to be something else. She moved into his bedroom on a Sunday, not because she wanted to, not because anything between them had shifted far enough to make that feel natural. She moved into his bedroom because Marjorie Keene had laid out the situation with the precision of someone reading a damage assessment. And the assessment was the Pembrokes' attorneys had already begun building a paper trail. Investigators documenting public appearances. Staff interviewed quietly, carefully, with questions designed to establish that the Vercetti marriage had all the structural hallmarks of a fabricated arrangement. Separate bedrooms was the detail they would use first. It was the cleanest evidence, the most legible. Marjorie had said it on the phone without apology. You need to close that gap, physically and visibly. Damon had told her the same night, standing in the hallway outside her suite, with his arms crossed and his expression doing the thing it did when he was presenting information he found personally uncomfortable. You keep your space, he said. I'll sleep in the sitting room off the master. Nobody goes in there except us. But from the outside we share a room, she finished. Yes. She had stood there for a moment. Fine, she said. Audrey Damon, it's fine. She said it the way a person says something is fine when they mean I have processed this, and I'm not going to make it into a scene. This isn't the part that bothers me. He looked at her. What's the part that bothers you? The part where two people who started a business arrangement are now required to perform a marriage in enough detail to survive a legal challenge. She met his eyes. Because that's not what I signed up for, and we both know it. He held her gaze. No, it's not. But we're doing it anyway. Unless you want to let them win. She thought about Constance Pembroke's face at the fundraiser. The engineering behind it. The 40 years of social management that had produced a woman who could threaten her own son's future to preserve her family's reputation. I don't want to let them win, she said. Then we do it anyway. She had moved her things the next morning. The first week inside the master suite was an exercise in the specific discomfort of proximity without intimacy. Damon was constitutionally tidy. His side of the bathroom was organized with a precision that bordered on compulsive products arranged by height, nothing left on the counter that wasn't in daily use. He moved through the space without encroaching on hers, which she appreciated and simultaneously found slightly maddening, because it meant he had thought about the geometry of it. He had made a plan. She hadn't been consulted on the plan, but the plan was considerate, and being the recipient of someone's careful consideration without being asked what you needed was its own particular experience. She left her law textbooks on the chair by the window. He didn't move them. She found coffee made every morning when she came out of the bathroom. She didn't ask him to stop. On Thursday night, she woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of him in the sitting room, not loud, just present, the specific acoustic signature of someone awake in a space where the walls weren't thick enough to be absolute. She lay in the dark and listened, and eventually heard it resolve into the quiet again. The next morning she said, "You were up last night." He was reading something at the small table by the window. He looked up. Problem with one of the developments. It got managed. What kind of problem? He held her gaze for a moment. They had had the full briefing with his attorney 2 days after the lawsuit was filed, 3 hours in a conference room, with documents and legal assessments, and a landscape of his operations that was, as he had warned her, complex and legally ambiguous in places. She had taken notes. She had asked questions that made his attorney visibly uncomfortable, and that Damon had answered without deflecting. The briefing had clarified one thing above everything else. She was not walking away from this arrangement easily, because walking away now meant walking away in the middle of a lawsuit that named her as a participant. She was in it, fully and completely, and without a clean exit. A contractor who's been skimming from a renovation budget, he said. It's been handled. Handled how? He was removed from the project and his contract was terminated. He paused. Legally. You feel the need to specify legally. With you, yes. I've started to feel the need to be very specific about my language. She sat down across from him with her coffee. Good, she said. He almost smiled. Yeah, he said. Probably good. The deposition notice arrived on a Tuesday. Marjorie called it in before the physical document reached them, which meant she had her own lines of communication into the Pembroke legal operation and was using them, which Audrey filed as useful information about how Marjorie Keene actually operated. They want sworn statements from both of you, Marjorie said. They're also requesting statements from household staff. Ferris, the drivers, anyone who can speak to the domestic arrangements of your marriage. Audrey was in the kitchen. She put her mug down. Ferris, she said. He'll be prepared. Damon's legal team will handle that. A pause. What I need to prepare you for is something different. Marjorie's voice shifted slightly, a register of carefully managed concern. They have obtained financial records from the development project, the one that generated the original debt. And there are documents in those records that create a problem. What kind of documents? Records suggesting that Damon entered into the original agreement with the Pembrokes with knowledge that certain projected returns were not achievable, that he may have known the deal was structurally unsound before they committed. The kitchen was very quiet. Are you saying he defrauded them? Audrey said. I'm saying they are going to argue that he did, and that your marriage was not just revenge, but the final phase of a long-running coercion strategy. Marjorie paused. They're going to argue that you were either complicit or a victim. Either way, your legal position becomes significantly more complicated. Audrey stood at the kitchen counter. Has Damon seen these documents? His attorneys have been briefed. He knows. Since when? A pause that answered the question before Marjorie's voice did. Since yesterday morning. He had known since yesterday morning. She had sat across from him at breakfast. She had asked him about the contractor issue. He had been specific about his language, which she had noted as a change, a good one, evidence of adjustment. He had known since yesterday morning, and he had not told her. She said, "Thank you, Marjorie," and ended the call and stood at the counter until she was certain her voice would come out level. Then she went upstairs. He was in his office. Of course he was. She opened the door without knocking. He looked up. He read her face in under a second and set down what he was holding with the deliberate care of someone putting something fragile on a surface. You talked to Marjorie, he said. Yesterday morning, Damon. He didn't look away. Yes, you sat across from me at breakfast yesterday morning. I know. And you let me ask you about a contractor issue, and you were very specific about your language, and you knew about the documents. Audrey don't. She came into the room and stopped in the middle of it. Not at his desk. She needed the space between them. Don't say my name like that. Like that's going to slow this down. She held his gaze. I told you. When you didn't disclose the federal inquiry, I told you that the next thing had to come from you. Immediately. We had that conversation. You agreed. He stood up. Slowly. The way he did things when he was making himself move at a deliberate pace instead of the one his actual instincts were running at. I was trying to verify the documents before I brought them to you, he said. I needed to know whether they were authentic or manufactured by the Pembrokes' legal team. And a pause. They're authentic, he said. The word landed in the room and stayed there. She absorbed it. What does authentic mean? She said. Specifically. Walk me through what those documents actually show. He came around the desk. Not toward her, he stopped at the corner of it, maintaining the distance she'd established. And he told her. The original development deal with the Pembrokes had been a joint venture, a commercial property on Chicago's north side that Damon had brought to them as an investment opportunity. The projected returns were aggressive. He had known when the projections were built that they required market conditions that were possible but not probable. He had disclosed this in the offering documents, technically, in language that was accurate and strategically dense, the kind of language that was designed to be technically true and practically obscuring. The Pembrokes had signed. They were sophisticated investors. They had their own attorneys. The deal had failed. Not because Damon had stolen from them, he hadn't, but because the projections had been built to be compelling rather than conservative, and he had known the difference. $7 million gone. And the lawsuit they had now filed was claiming that the marriage was the final instrument in a plan that had started with the development deal, get them to invest, let the deal fail, use the debt as leverage, and when the leverage wasn't enough, marry their son's abandoned fiancée to destroy them socially. Is that what it was? She asked. He looked at her. No, he said, but you can see why it looks like it. Yes. And you didn't tell me this yesterday because you were verifying the documents. Yes, Damon. She put both hands flat on the back of the chair between them. I'm in law school. I'm studying contract law specifically. I have read the clause in our agreement that governs disclosure obligations approximately 8 times since the lawsuit was filed. She kept her voice very steady. I need you to tell me whether there is anything else. Anything that those attorneys have or could have or are building toward that, I don't know about yet. I need you to tell me right now. He looked at her for a long moment. There's a witness, he said. Something cold moved through her. What kind of witness? Someone from inside my operation. A former financial manager who was terminated 8 months ago. He said it carefully. He's been in contact with the Pembrokes' legal team. We found out 3 days ago. 3 days ago, she took her hands off the chair. What is he telling them? We don't know the full scope yet. What we know is that he was present for certain internal financial discussions during the development deal period. He can speak to intent in a way that documents can't. He held her gaze. His name is Warren Price. He was with my organization for 6 years before I let him go. Why did you let him go? A pause. The kind that had a specific shape to it. Because he was skimming, Damon said, from a different project. I terminated his contract and gave him a settlement in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement. She stared at him. He signed an NDA, she said, yes. Which he is now violating. Damon's jaw was set. My attorneys are already filing for an injunction. Whether it holds in the context of a civil suit is my... It probably won't hold, she said. Not if the information he's providing is material evidence in an active case. Courts don't generally enforce NDAs that function to suppress legally relevant testimony. She heard herself say it, and registered, from a distance, that 6 weeks of law school had already started rewiring the way she parsed language. Marjorie didn't mention him. Marjorie may not know yet. We've been keeping the Price situation contained. Contained. She said the word back to him. His expression did something she hadn't seen before, a flash of something that was not quite frustration and not quite guilt, but occupied the territory between them. I know how it sounds, he said. How does it sound, Damon? Tell me how you think it sounds. It sounds like I keep managing information instead of sharing it. He said it straight. No deflection. And it sounds like every time I make that choice, I'm deciding that my judgment about what you need to know supersedes the agreement we made. And I know it's not just about the agreement. She was aware her voice had gotten quieter, which was a sign she recognized in herself. The quieter she got, the further from manageable the emotion was. When you don't tell me things, I can't trust my own read of this situation. I can't tell what's real and what you've decided to protect me from. And I cannot operate inside something I can't trust my own read of. I spent 3 years in a relationship where I couldn't trust my own read of things, and I told myself it would be different here because you were different. And you are different. You're honestly different from Grayson in almost every way that matters. But this, she stopped, pressed her fingers together. This is the same. He was very still. I know, he said. Quiet, the quietest she'd heard him. I need you to not do it again. I need it to be an actual change, not an adjustment. She looked at him. Can you do that? Yes. If something comes up tonight that affects this case or this arrangement or my legal position, I need to know about it tonight. Not after you've verified it and assessed it and decided how to frame it. Yes. She picked up her bag from the chair. I'm going to call Marjorie and tell her about Price, she said. She needs to know. I'll have my attorney reach out to her simultaneously. She nodded and walked to the door and then stopped because something had occurred to her. Something she needed to ask before it became a thing she'd left unasked. The projections in the development deal, she said without turning around. When you built them, did you believe they were achievable? A pause. In an optimal scenario, he said, yes. And you knew the scenario wasn't optimal. I knew it was possible. She stood at the door. "That's the difference between a lie and a calculated omission," she said. "And I think you've been living inside that difference for so long, you've stopped seeing it as a distinction worth making." She left before he could respond. Warren Price testified in a preliminary hearing 3 weeks later. Audrey was not present. Marjorie had advised against it. Her presence would generate coverage, and the coverage would generate narrative. The narrative would be whatever the Pembrokes' PR operation decided to make of it. She sat in the university library instead and read a civil procedure case that she could not afterward have summarized. And at 11:14, her phone showed a text from Marjorie that said, "It's worse than we thought." "Call me," she called from a study room with the door closed. "He didn't just speak to intent during the development," Marjorie said. "He had documentation, emails, internal memos from the planning phase of the deal that showed Damon's team explicitly discussed the gaps between the presented projections and the internal probability assessments." Audrey closed her eyes. "He kept copies," she said. "He kept everything. 6 years of operational documents that he was not supposed to retain after termination. The NDA prohibits disclosure of proprietary business information, but because these emails are being presented as evidence of potentially fraudulent conduct, his attorney is arguing that the public interest exception overrides the NDA." Marjorie paused. "The judge has not ruled yet, but the preliminary read is not favorable. What does this do to our case? It significantly changes the character of our defense. The Pembrokes' argument was always that your marriage was instrumental, a weapon, in a larger strategy. If a jury sees those emails, it becomes much easier to build a picture of Damon as someone who constructs long-term plans designed to extract value from specific targets." A pause. "And by extension, you become either a knowing participant or the most recent target." She sat in the study room, with the door closed and the ambient sound of the library beyond it, and she thought about what it felt like to be inside a story that had been constructed by someone else. She had thought she was making a choice, a calculated, eyes-open, contract-governed choice. She was beginning to understand that Damon Vercetti had been building something for a great deal longer than the 45 seconds he'd watched her on the cathedral steps. And she had stepped into the middle of it believing she understood the floor plan. She called him. He picked up immediately. "I know," he said. "Did you know about the emails?" A pause. "1 second." She counted. "I knew they existed," he said. "Did you know he had copies?" "No." Immediate no. "If I'd known Price kept copies, we would have—" He stopped himself. "No. I didn't know. I believe you," she said. "I want you to know that I believe that specific thing." He was quiet for a moment. "But," he said, "but you knew the emails existed, which means you knew the content of those emails, which means you knew that if they ever surfaced, they would look like exactly what the Pembrokes are now saying they look like." She kept her voice low and precise. "And you still didn't tell me the full picture of what we were walking into." "Audrey, I'm not ending this conversation. I'm not walking out on the case. I'm not using the exit clause." She said each thing clearly, because she needed him to hear them separately. "I'm telling you what I know so that you understand where I am. Because that is apparently the kind of clarity that has to be manually installed in this arrangement." A silence. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need everything. Every document, every email thread, every internal communication from the development deal period that is in any way relevant to what Price has put into the record. I need my own copy. I need to review it with Marjorie." She paused. "And I need you to understand that I'm doing this, not because I've decided to trust you completely, but because I've decided that the only way through this is to know more than anyone else in the room." "Okay," he said. "I want the documents tonight. You'll have them by 7. She hung up and sat for another moment, and then opened her laptop and pulled up the civil procedure case, and, this time, she actually read it. The documents arrived at 6:50. Ferris brought them in a locked case, with a separate envelope containing the decryption codes for the digital files, which told her something about the level of operational security Damon maintained around his internal communications. She signed a chain of custody receipt, which told her something about the level at which his attorneys were now treating every document exchange. She spent 4 hours going through them at the desk in the master suite, while Damon worked somewhere else in the penthouse and did not come in. The emails were damaging. She understood immediately why Price had kept them and why the Pembroke's attorneys found them useful, and why Marjorie's voice had carried that precise quality of controlled alarm. A sound like green wood splitting. The language was not illegal on its face. Damon's team had been careful, but it was the language of people who knew the distance between what they were presenting and what they actually believed. And they had committed that knowledge to writing in enough instances to build a credible narrative of intent. She also found something else. Deep in the financial planning documents, a subsidiary file she almost missed. There was a communication from 8 months before the deal closed. An email from Damon to his lead financial analyst. It said, "Adjust the waterfall projections by 40% and see whether the deal still works for them at that return. If it does, present the conservative version instead." She read it 3 times. The conservative version had never been presented. She didn't sleep that night. Sip scene. She lay in the bed in the master suite while Damon's careful presence occupied the sitting room on the other side of the closed door, and she stared at the ceiling and went through the email in her mind with the methodical precision that Dr. Hart had apparently been right to identify as her particular strength. By 3 in the morning, she had reached a conclusion she didn't entirely want to reach. The development deal had not been straightforwardly fraudulent. He had disclosed risk. He had not manufactured returns from nothing. The Pembrokes were sophisticated investors who had signed documents they should have read more carefully. But Damon had known the conservative projections existed. He had chosen not to present them. He had made a deliberate decision to show a version of the deal that was more compelling than the one he privately believed in. That was not the same as fraud. It was also not nothing. At 4 in the morning, she got up and knocked on the sitting room door. He was awake. Of course he was. She opened the door. He was sitting in the chair at the window dressed, which meant he hadn't tried to sleep either, and he looked at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded in a way she had never seen on his face before. Not in public, not in the kitchen, not in his office. The specific nakedness of a person who has been waiting for a verdict and knows they have no remaining angles to work. The email, she said, 8 months before closing. The conservative projections. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. You chose not to show them the version you believed in. Yes. She leaned against the doorframe. Why, she said. He was quiet for a moment, not calculating, processing. Because they were going to say no, he said. The conservative projections didn't produce a return that interested them. I knew that. I'd had enough preliminary conversations to know their threshold. He paused. And I wanted the deal. I wanted the project. It was important to me for reasons that were only partly financial. What were the other reasons? Another pause. Longer. My father built things in this city, he said. Bad things. Things that hurt people. When I took over, I told myself I would build something different. Something real. He looked at his hands. That property was one of the first developments I wanted to do differently. Properly. And I needed their capital to do it. And I knew the honest version wouldn't get their capital, so He stopped. So you built them a version that would? Yes. She stood in the doorway. The deal still failed, she said. They still lost $7 million. Yes. And the property is sitting half-finished on the north side. His jaw tightened. Which is its own kind of answer to what I did. She looked at him for a long time. This was the thing she hadn't been able to locate before, underneath all of it. Not the legal exposure, not the NDA violation, not even the pattern of managed disclosures. This, a man who had grown up inside something dark and was genuinely trying to build his way out of it and had used the same tools he was trying to leave behind to fund the construction. It didn't exonerate him. It made him human in a way that was much harder to be angry at than a simpler version of the story would have been. The lawsuit, she said. Marjorie thinks it's survivable. My attorneys think it's survivable. But the Price testimony changes our position significantly. Yes. And the emails, if the judge allows them into evidence, change it further. Yes. She pushed off the doorframe. Then we have a problem, she said, and it is no longer the kind of problem that gets solved by careful document management. She looked at him directly. The only way through this is if I stand up in that courtroom and speak for this marriage as someone who actually believes in it, not as a performance, because a performance will not survive what the Pembrokes are going to do in cross-examination. She held his gaze, which means I need to actually believe in it. And right now, I'm not sure what I believe. He stood up. He crossed the distance between them slowly and stopped 2 feet away and did not reach for her, just stood there in the 4 o'clock dark with his hands at his sides and his face completely open in the way she was learning. He could only be when everything else had been stripped away. What would it take, he said. Tell me, not what you think I can do. Tell me what it would actually take. She looked at him. I need to know that the man who wrote that email is not the man I'm standing here with right now, she said. I need to see the difference. Not because I need you to be perfect. I don't. I need you to be someone who has actually changed, not someone who is managing the performance of change. He stood there. I know how to show you that, he said. How? There's a decision I've been avoiding, he said. About the Pembroke debt. He held her gaze. I've been holding it as leverage. The original $7 million, even with the lawsuit, even with everything I've been holding it, because it was the one concrete thing I had. The one thing they couldn't completely reframe. He paused. I'm going to erase it. She stared at him. If I erase the debt, he said, the financial motive disappears. The coercion argument loses its structural center. It doesn't save from these emails or from price, but it removes the piece of this that I built from the worst version of myself. He didn't look away. And it means I lose my most significant piece of leverage against the people who publicly humiliated the woman He stopped. Started again against the Pembrokes. For good. She was very still. You'd be giving up your best weapon, she said. Yes. In the middle of a lawsuit they filed against you. Yes. That doesn't make strategic sense. No, he said. It doesn't. A pause. That's how you know it's real. She stood in the doorway at 4 a.m. and looked at Damon Vercetti and understood something she had been trying not to understand for several weeks. She was not standing here because of the contract. She had not been standing here because of the contract for some time. She had no idea when it had stopped being about the contract, which was itself the most frightening piece of information she had encountered since Marjorie's call about Warren Price. Make the call, she said. His expression did not break into relief or gratitude. Was ease. He simply nodded once. The way he confirmed decisions, and she understood that it was already done in his mind, had been done the moment he offered it. She went back to bed. A sound like green. She did not sleep, but she lay down and she stared at the ceiling and she thought about a man who built things and a deal that had failed and a half-finished property on the north side of Chicago that was apparently still sitting there, waiting for someone to decide what it was supposed to be. And she thought about the fact that she was 3 months in a 12-month contract, and she was already so far from the woman who had signed it that she could not plot a clean line back. The lawsuit was going to get worse before it got better. Price's testimony was going to put things into the record that could not be unread. The emails were going to be argued over in a courtroom in front of a judge who had not yet decided what to do with them. And somewhere in all of that, she was going to have to stand up and speak the truth about this marriage. The problem, the real problem, the one that kept her staring at the ceiling until the light changed, was that the truth had become far more complicated and far more real than anything she had agreed to perform. The debt erasure hit the Pembroke legal team like a structural failure. Marjorie called Audrey at 7:15 on a Thursday morning, 6 days after Damon had made the call, while Audrey was standing in the kitchen in yesterday's socks with coffee she hadn't touched yet. They're recalibrating, Marjorie said. The financial coercion argument was load-bearing for them. Without it, the entire conspiracy framework loses its center of gravity, a pause that had a specific quality of professional satisfaction underneath its neutrality. They're not done, but they're rattled. What do they pivot to? The emails, Price, and you. Marjorie's voice tightened slightly. They're going to make the trial about your credibility, specifically. They'll argue that you're either a knowing participant in a long-running fraud scheme or a naive woman who was exploited by a sophisticated criminal operator. Either way, they put you on the stand and they take you apart. Audrey drank her coffee. Let them, she said. Silence on the line. Audrey, I've been deposed twice in the last 3 weeks. I've read every document in that discovery file. I know this case better than most of the junior attorneys working it. She set the mug down. Let them put me on the stand. I'm not afraid of what I know. Marjorie was quiet for a moment. What about what you feel? Audrey didn't answer immediately. I'll manage it, she said. She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but it was the answer available to her that morning, so she used it. The trial date was set for a Wednesday in February, which gave them 11 weeks. 11 weeks of deposition preparation, document review, strategy sessions with Marjorie, and with Damon's legal team, operating in careful parallel, occasionally overlapping, constantly navigating the specific challenge of two separate legal interests that were aligned but not identical. Audrey kept going to law school. This surprised people. She registered the surprise in her professor's expressions when she appeared in class the morning after particularly damaging news coverage. Price's testimony had leaked to a legal affairs blog, which had been picked up by 3 mainstream outlets, which had produced a news cycle that spent 4 days analyzing whether Audrey Vercetti was a victim or a co-conspirator. She appeared in her 9 o'clock contracts class the morning that cycle peaked, sat in her usual seat 3 rows from the front, and took notes for 90 minutes. Dr. Hart stopped her again afterward. The Price situation, she said, with the directness of someone who had decided that pretending not to know would be a greater insult. How are you holding up? I'm here, Audrey said. Yes, I noticed. Dr. Hart looked at her over her glasses. The analysis you submitted on anticipatory breach last week was the strongest in the class. By a significant margin. Audrey processed that. Thank you. I'm not telling you for encouragement. I'm telling you because you should know what you're capable of before you walk into a courtroom. She paused. Whatever the outcome of the case, Miss Bellamy misses. Vercetti, you have a future in this profession. Don't let this consume it. She walked back to her car in the February cold and sat behind the wheel for 3 minutes before starting the engine. She was not going to let it consume it. She was also not going to pretend it wasn't consuming parts of her that law schools couldn't reach. Damon changed after the debt erasure. Not dramatically. He was not the kind of man who changed dramatically. He was the kind of man who adjusted his architecture so quietly and precisely that you only noticed it by measuring the distance between where he'd been and where he was now. He started eating dinner at the table instead of at his desk. He stopped taking calls after 10 at night. He appeared twice, in the doorway of the study where she was working, and asked questions about her cases that were genuine, rather than conversational questions that indicated he had been listening to things she'd mentioned in passing, and had continued thinking about them after she stopped talking. He stopped managing her information. This was the most significant change and the hardest one to trust, because it was the change she'd asked for, and she knew that requested changes were the easiest to perform and the hardest to sustain. But 3 weeks out from the trial, something happened that tested it immediately. She was in the kitchen at 6. In the evening, when Damon came in from a meeting and put his jacket over the chair and stood at the counter and said, without preamble, Price approached one of my associates this afternoon. She looked up. He made contact through an intermediary, offered to modify his testimony in exchange for payment. His voice was absolutely flat. He's been approached by my associate and declined, and the approach was immediately documented and reported to my attorneys. She stared at him. He tried to sell his testimony. Yes, to your side, yes. And your associate turned it down immediately and documented everything. Within the hour, he held her gaze. I'm telling you, within 2 hours of finding out, before my attorneys fully briefed me, because that's what we agreed. She absorbed this. The documentation is clean, time-stamped, witnessed, already filed with Marjorie's office. This could be significant at trial. My attorneys think it destroys Price's credibility entirely. A witness who attempts to sell modified testimony is someone a jury will not trust regardless of what he says, she finished. Yes. She felt something shift in her chest, not relief, not yet, but the specific feeling of a structural problem revealing a hidden load-bearing solution. You came to me first, yes. She looked at him for a moment. You, she said. It was a small thing to say. It was not a small thing to mean. He nodded and picked up his jacket, and she thought he was going to his office, and then he stopped at the kitchen doorway. Audrey, he turned. When this is over, when the trial is done, he stopped. Reassembled. I'd like to talk about what we do after. She was very still. After the trial, she said. After everything, his expression was open in the way it only got at 4 in the morning, or in moments he hadn't planned for. The contract. What you want. Whether he stopped again. I know this isn't the right time. I know there's a trial in 3 weeks, and that's what matters right now. His jaw tightened fractionally. I just needed you to know that I'm thinking about after. That there is an after I want to have a conversation about. She held his gaze. Oh, quiet. He nodded once. Went to his office. She stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment and then turned back to her laptop and opened her case files and told herself that the feeling currently occupying her chest was something she could categorize later. The trial started at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday in February with the kind of cold outside that Chicago produced specifically to remind people that the city had no interest in their personal circumstances. The courtroom was full. Audrey had known it would be. The case had generated the kind of coverage that attracted people who wanted to watch something combust in real time, a society lawsuit involving a Mafia-adjacent billionaire, an abandoned bride, and a 7-year-old development deal that had destroyed $7 million. The gallery was at capacity, and there were cameras outside, and Audrey had walked through them with Damon's hand at her back, and her face arranged into the expression she had practiced, present, composed, and entirely unwilling to perform distress for anyone's coverage. Inside, she sat next to Marjorie at the plaintiff's defense table and watched the room settle and felt her heartbeat, doing something steady and slightly faster than normal in her chest, and she breathed through it. Damon sat at the adjacent table with his lead attorney, a precise and economical man named Theodore Voss, who had the affect of someone who had been in enough courtrooms to find them boring and enough trials to know that boredom was a strategic advantage. Across the room, the Pembroke's legal team arranged itself with the deliberate visual weight of a team that had resources and intended to be seen having them. 3 attorneys, 2 paralegals, a consultant who appeared to be there specifically to observe and take notes. Constance Pembroke sat in the gallery's front row. Grayson was not present. Audrey had wondered whether he would be, and felt something clarify inside her when she saw he wasn't. Not relief. Exactly. More like the confirmation of something she'd already known about him. He had always been better at absences than appearances when they cost him something. The Pembroke's lead attorney was a man named Roland Fitch, who had the silver hair and controlled cadence of someone who understood that juries and judges responded to the performance of certainty. He opened with a methodical precision that Audrey could not help from 3 rows away and 6 weeks of law school into her 2nd semester, evaluating as a structural argument. He was good. She gave him that. He built the conspiracy narrative cleanly, development deal, constructed with misleading projections, debt used as leverage, marriage deployed as social weapon, the abandoned bride as both instrument and cover. He connected each element to the next with the logical fluency of someone who had rehearsed the sequence until it felt inevitable. Then he said Audrey's name. He said it the way you deploy a piece of evidence specifically, at the moment when the room's attention was at its peak. Mrs. Vercetti, he said, and let the name do what the name did in a room where everyone knew the 2 parts of it and what they each implied, entered this marriage not as a romantic partner, but as a strategic asset. A woman in pain, deliberately selected for her emotional vulnerability and her existing relationship to the Pembroke family. Used to accomplish through personal destruction what $7 million in litigation could not accomplish through legal means. Audrey sat completely still. Marjorie's hand found her forearm under the table. Brief, a pressure that said hold, she held. Voss's opening was shorter and more surgical. He did not try to make Damon sympathetic, he made him competent and specific. He attacked the conspiracy framework at its joints. The voluntary erasure of the debt removed the coercion motive. The independent legal representation during contract negotiation removed the exploitation argument, and the price testimony issue he raised it here. Early as a preemptive strike, removed the credibility of the only witness who could speak to internal intent. The Pembroke family, Voss concluded, with the toneless delivery of someone reading a verdict they've already written, have attempted to reframe their own financial losses and social embarrassment as a criminal conspiracy. What the evidence will show is that a sophisticated investment family made an investment that failed, and rather than accept that outcome, they have constructed a legal action designed to punish the woman their son rejected and the man she chose instead. The room processed that. Audrey breathed. The first 3 days were documentary. Financial records. Development projections. The deal's planning documents introduced methodically by Fitch's team and challenged methodically by Voss's. Witnesses who spoke in the specific register of professional certainty that could be eroded only by other experts, speaking with equal certainty in the opposite direction. Audrey watched all of it with the attention of someone who was also studying it. She was going to testify. She had known this from the beginning. Marjorie had prepared her for 4 sessions, 2 hours each, going through every question Fitch might ask and every answer Audrey could give, and the distance between what was true and what was useful, and how to navigate that distance without perjuring herself. Tell the truth, Marjorie had said in their last session. Specifically and completely, the details of the contract, the separate bedrooms arrangement, the financial terms, don't minimize any of it. It's in the documents. They have it. If you minimize it, you look evasive. If you state it plainly, you look like someone who understood exactly what she was doing. Which I did, Audrey said. Which you did. That's your defense. Marjorie had looked at her. The conspiracy argument requires you to be either a victim or a participant. Your job is to be neither. Your job is to be a competent adult who made a considered decision under difficult circumstances and has the documentation to prove it. And the part where the marriage became real. Marjorie had been quiet for a moment. That's the part they'll try to take apart, she said. They'll argue it's fabricated. They'll push on the timeline, the contract terms, the financial dependency. They'll try to make you look like someone who's performing a story. And if I'm not performing, then tell the truth. Specifically, Marjorie held her gaze. The truth is specific. Performance is general. If you're telling the truth, the details will be there. Let the details carry it. Warren Price took the stand on day 4. He was a man in his mid-50s, with the specific look of someone who had made a decision they were committed to and would carry that commitment with the solemnity of genuine conviction, or the performance of it. She couldn't tell yet. He was well dressed. His attorney had dressed him for credibility. He spoke in measured, organized sentences. Fitch walked him through 6 years of employment with Damon Vercetti's organization, through his role in financial planning, through the development deal, through specific emails and internal conversations. The emails. They were entered into evidence. The judge had ruled 2 weeks prior that the public interest exception applied, that evidence potentially relevant to fraud could not be suppressed by a private NDA regardless of its terms. She had known it was coming. She had sat in this courtroom for 3 days, specifically to be unsurprised when it came. She was not entirely unsurprised. Price read the relevant email aloud from the exhibit. Damon's voice, 8 months before closing, in writing, adjust the waterfall projections by 40% and see whether the deal still works for them at that return. If it does, present the conservative version instead. The conservative version had not been presented. The courtroom had a particular quality of attentiveness during Price's testimony. The kind that had a sound, not silence exactly, but the specific absence of movement that happens when everyone in a room is doing the same thing at once. Voss cross-examined for 90 minutes. He started with the NDA. Price acknowledged signing it, acknowledged the settlement, acknowledged the terms. Then Voss introduced the documented contact, the approach to Damon's associate, the offer to modify testimony, the time-stamped record of the refusal. Price's attorney objected 3 times. The judge sustained once and overruled twice. Mr. Price Voss stood at the podium with the posture of someone who had been waiting for this particular moment across 4 days of trial. You testified that your decision to come forward with these documents was motivated by a desire to provide truthful and relevant testimony in a civil proceeding. That's correct. And yet you approached a representative of the defendant's organization approximately 3 weeks ago and offered to, and I'm reading from the documented communication here, adjust the scope and framing of my testimony in exchange for a mutually beneficial arrangement. A pause. I don't recall, Mr. Price. Voss's voice didn't rise. It simply became the only relevant sound in the room. The documented communication includes a timestamp, the name of the intermediary, and a verbatim account of the offer as recorded by the individual who declined it and immediately reported it to legal counsel. Do you need me to read it into the record? Silence. That conversation was Price. Stopped. Restarted. There was a conversation. It was exploratory. You offered to modify your testimony for money. Yes or no, Mr. Price? The conversation was. No further questions. The gallery produced a sound. Not quite a murmur. More like the collective recalibration of people who had come in expecting something and received something different. Audrey looked at Marjorie. Marjorie was writing something on her legal pad. She wrote 2 words. She tilted the pad slightly so Audrey could see. Audrey took the stand on day 5. She had chosen what she was wearing with the same logic she'd applied to the fundraiser dress, what she actually looked like, not what she'd been trained to look like. Dark gray, structured, practical. No jewelry except her the ring from the contract wedding, the one she had not removed, which she was aware the room would register. Fitch came at her for 2.5 hours. He was precise and relentless, and occasionally slightly cruel in the way that experienced trial attorneys could be when they had identified the exact points of pressure in a witness's testimony and were applying force to each of them in sequence. The contract. She stated its terms plainly. Separate bedrooms, yes. Financial arrangement, yes. Independent legal representation, yes. Timeline married within 48 hours of Grayson's abandonment, yes. So you married a man you had met 45 minutes earlier, Fitch said. I married a man I had met 48 hours earlier, she said. After reviewing a 40-page legal document with an independent attorney of my own choosing. Because he offered you money. Because he offered me a legal agreement with defined protections and defined obligations. Yes, with financial components. Correctly described as a business arrangement. She held Fitch's gaze. Which is also, I don't know, how most of the Pembroke family's professional relationships have been structured for 3 generations. A sound from the gallery. Fitch moved on without acknowledging it. He pushed on the emotional circumstances, the cathedral steps. Her state of mind, whether she was capable of making a rational decision within hours of a public humiliation. I was entirely capable, she said. I read the contract for 3 hours. I took notes. I requested an amendment. The amendment was accepted. I slept on it. I signed the next morning. She paused. If that's the behavior of someone incapable of rational decision-making, I'd suggest the bar for rationality in this courtroom is set very high. He pushed on Damon. She answered his questions about Damon the way Marjorie had taught her, specifically, with detail, without minimizing and without performing warmth. She described the man she had actually come to know across the months of their marriage with the precision of someone who had been paying careful attention. You claim the marriage evolved from a business arrangement into something genuine, Fitch said. His voice had the tone of someone setting up a dismantlement. Can you point to a specific moment when that transition occurred? She thought about it. No, she said. Fitch paused. He had expected more. Genuine things don't usually have a specific moment, she said. That's how you know they're genuine. Performed things have moments you can mark them because they were constructed. The fact that I can't point to a single moment is the answer to your question, Mr. Fitch, not the problem with it. Silence. Fitch moved to the email. The waterfall projections email. You've read this email, he said. You know what it shows. I know what it shows, yes. And you still characterize your husband as someone who has acted honorably toward you. I characterize my husband as someone who made a dishonest decision in a business context 8 years ago and has been living with the consequences of it since. She met Fitch's eyes. Those aren't the same thing. People are not single decisions. If they were, this courtroom would be a much simpler place. He pushed harder on price, on the federal inquiry, on the nature of Damon's business interests. She answered each question with the same precision. Not defensive, not emotional, present and specific and completely disinclined to give him the version of her that his argument required the naive victim or the knowing conspirator. At the 2-hour mark, Fitch tried something different. Mrs. Vercetti. He changed his cadence slightly. Slower. Almost conversational. Do you love your husband? The courtroom went still. Marjorie had warned her this was coming. Had told her exactly how to handle it factually, without theatrics, with the acknowledgement that the question was designed to trap regardless of the answer. She looked at Fitch for one moment. Then she looked at Damon. He was at the adjacent table, and he was looking at her. His expression had the quality she had learned to read over months of close proximity, the constant of a man who was managing a great deal of feeling with a great deal of discipline, and the specific fracture in that control that she had only ever seen at 4 in the morning. She looked back at Fitch. Yes, she said. No elaboration. No performance. Just the word, stated with the flat certainty of something true. Fitch paused for a half-second long enough to tell her it was not the answer he'd built his follow-up around. And yet you entered this marriage as a business transaction. Yes, and I entered law school as a survival strategy. And I'm finding out that I love that too. She held his gaze. People enter things for one reason and find another inside them. That's not evidence of fraud. That's just how it goes. Fitch looked at her for a moment. Nothing further, he said. Marjorie's redirect was 20 minutes. She walked Audrey through the independent legal representation, the contract amendment, the documented chronology of the marriage. She introduced the letter from Constance, the one that had offered to assist Audrey in exchange for an annulment, and let it speak. She asked one final question. Mrs. Vercetti, the Pembrokes have argued that your marriage was designed to damage their reputation. In your estimation, what has actually damaged their reputation? Audrey looked at the jury. Grayson Pembroke canceled his own wedding in front of 200 people and told the woman he'd been with for 3 years that she wasn't good enough for his family, she said. And then his mother sent a letter offering to pay for my education if I'd disappear quietly. She paused. I didn't damage their reputation. Their behavior is their reputation. I just stopped being quiet about what I experienced inside it. Marjorie said nothing further and sat down. The courtroom was not silent exactly. It was the sound of people absorbing something and not yet knowing what to do with it. Closing arguments were scheduled for the following morning. Audrey sat with Marjorie in a conference room down the hall from the courtroom and drank cold coffee and went through the jury 12 people she had been watching for 5 days, cataloging their reactions the way Dr. Hart had taught her to catalog legal language, what they responded to, what left them unmoved, what made 3 of them, in the back row, exchange glances that carried weight. The foreman is the problem, Marjorie said. She was at the whiteboard with a marker, mapping. He's a retired engineer, process-oriented. He's been skeptical of the emotional testimony and engaged with the documentary evidence. If he leads deliberations toward the email doesn't prove fraud, Audrey said. It proves a bad decision that was disclosed in the offering documents, even if it was disclosed badly. A sophisticated investor who signed those documents cannot claim they were unaware of risk. Marjorie looked at her. You just summarized Voss's closing argument, she said. It's the right argument. Audrey set down the coffee. Fitch is going to give an emotional close. He's going to bring it back to the conspiracy narrative and try to make the jury feel that something wrong was done to a prominent Chicago family. She paused. Voss needs to be colder, more technical. Give the foreman permission to vote on process rather than feeling. Marjorie sat down across from her. 3 months ago, you were standing on cathedral steps in a torn dress, she said. I know. Now you're pre-reading closing arguments. Law school helps, Audrey said. Also, I've had an unusual amount of motivation to pay attention. Marjorie almost smiled. The door to the conference room opened. Voss appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man delivering information in a professional context that had personal implications. There's a development, he said. Audrey put down her coffee. Damon appeared behind Voss. He came into the room and looked at Audrey directly, and she saw on his face the thing that she had learned to read as the signal that what came next was real and unmanaged. Fitch made a settlement approach 20 minutes ago, Voss said. The room adjusted around the information. What terms? Marjorie said. They dropped the lawsuit. Full withdrawal. In exchange for Voss paused. The pause was a half-second, and it was the most expressive pause she had heard from him across 5 days of trial. In exchange for a public statement from Damon, acknowledging that the development deal projections were misleading. No admission of fraud, no financial settlement, just the statement. Audrey looked at Damon. He was looking at her. It ends the case, Voss said. Today, without deliberation, without verdict, without the jury taking those emails into a room and deciding what to do with them. The stage sword, Audrey said. What does it do to him? Publicly, it confirms that the deal was not presented with full transparency. It won't generate legal exposure, the language is carefully constructed, but in terms of reputations. His reputation takes a hit, she said, yes. She looked at Damon. What do you want to do, she said. He held her gaze. I want to know what you think, he said. This was not something he had said to her before. Not in this way, not as an actual question, not as a genuine transfer of decision-making weight. He had consulted her. He had informed her. He had, more recently, told her things before he'd fully processed them himself. But this was different. This was him, standing in a conference room outside a courtroom where his reputation and her future were equally at stake, and handing her the question without a frame around it. She thought about the jury, the foreman, the emails. Price's demolished credibility. She thought about Voss's closing argument and what it could do with 5 days of carefully built technical defense. She thought about what it would cost Damon to make that statement. Not legally, it was managed, reputationally. In the city he operated in, among people who understood what acknowledging misleading projections meant in practical terms, regardless of the legal framing. She thought about a half-finished property on the north side of Chicago, sitting there since the deal failed, waiting. Don't take it, she said. Voss looked at her. Marjorie was very still. Damon's expression didn't move. We go to closing arguments tomorrow, she said. We let Voss make the technical case. We let the foreman lead the jury toward process. We let Price's credibility do what it's going to do. She held Damon's gaze. If you make that statement, it follows you. The case ends, but the statement stays. Every deal, every development, every legitimate thing you try to build from, here it has that statement attached to it. She paused. You told me you wanted to build something real. You don't build something real on an admission you made to make a lawsuit go away. The conference room was quiet. Damon looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Voss. Tell them no, he said. Voss nodded once and left the room. Marjorie exhaled and reached for her own coffee. Damon didn't move. He was still looking at Audrey with the open, unguarded expression that she had stopped being surprised by and started being undone by, which was its own problem that she was going to have to address when there was time. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. The settlement was cleaner for you. Faster, less exposure. I know that too. She picked up her coffee. You gave up $7 million for me. I can give up a settlement offer for you. She looked at him over the rim of the mug. That's what it is to be actually married to someone. You fight their battles like they're yours. He stood across the table from her and said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, We're going to win tomorrow. Yes, she said, we are. She believed it with the specific certainty of someone who had read every document in the case and watched every juror for 5 days and understood that the strongest argument in that courtroom was the one that was also true. Marjorie opened her laptop. Then let's spend the next 3 hours making sure of it, she said. A sound like until midnight. The 3 of them around the conference table with the Chicago night pressed against the windows, and at some point Damon went out and came back with food that nobody had asked for, but that everyone needed. A sound like green, and at some point Audrey looked up from her notes and found him looking at her with the expression she still didn't have an adequate word for, and she looked back down at her notes and kept working, because tomorrow was going to require everything she had, and the feeling in her chest was going to have to wait. Closing arguments started at 9 in the morning, and the courtroom filled before 8:30. Audrey knew because she arrived at 8:15 and had to move through a gallery that was already three-quarters occupied, people settling into seats with the specific anticipatory energy of an audience that understood a 5-day buildup was about to resolve. She walked to the defense table without looking at the gallery and sat down and opened her notepad to a clean page and wrote nothing on it. Marjorie arrived at 8:20 with coffee and an expression that said she had been awake since 5 and had made peace with that. Damon arrived at 8:30 with Voss and sat at the adjacent table and looked at Audrey once, not a performance, not for the room, just a direct look that lasted 2 seconds and communicated something she had stopped trying to translate into language, because language kept being inadequate, and then looked forward. Constance Pembroke was in the gallery's front row again. Same seat, same posture. Audrey looked at her once and looked away. Fitch went first. He was good. She had acknowledged this before, and she acknowledged it again now, watching him work the room with the controlled fluency of someone who had done this for 30 years and understood that closing arguments were about emotion shaped by logic rather than logic delivered emotionally. He rebuilt the conspiracy narrative from its components, methodically and compellingly, and he gave the jury permission to feel the weight of it: the abandoned bride, the Mafia-connected billionaire, the failed deal, the social war dressed as a love story. He spent 12 minutes on the emails. He was right to. They were the strongest material he had, and he knew it, and he handled them with the care of someone placing a precise weight on a precise point. He spent 8 minutes on price, acknowledging testimony for sale incident with the specificity of someone who intended to reframe it. A man who made a mistake in a moment of financial desperation does not thereby become a liar about everything he witnessed. You heard his account. You saw the documents. Ask yourself whether the attempt to buy his silence tells you more about Warren Price or more about Damon Vercetti. He spent the final 6 minutes on Audrey. She kept her face entirely still. He didn't attack her. She had half expected him to. The cross-examination had been aggressive enough that a continuation in closing felt like a reasonable tactical choice. Instead, he did something more careful and more damaging. He expressed concern for her. Measured, professional concern. He described her as a woman who had been in a vulnerable position and had been offered a structured exit from that vulnerability by a sophisticated operator, and who had understandably, humanly, without any moral failing on her part, come to believe in the arrangement she was living inside. We don't blame Mrs. Vercetti, he said. We never have. What we ask you to see is that her belief in this marriage is not evidence that the marriage was genuine. It is evidence that she is a person who, once she commits to something, commits fully. He paused. And that is not a character flaw. That is, in fact, her most admirable quality. It's also exactly why she was chosen. The room was completely still. Audrey breathed through her nose and kept her hands flat on the table and did not allow her expression to move. Fitch sat down. Voss stood up. He was at the podium for 41 minutes. Audrey had expected technical. She got technical, and something she hadn't anticipated, a kind of spare, methodical humanity that was more effective than anything theatrical would have been. He didn't perform. He organized. He took the jury through the documentary evidence with the patience of someone who trusted the evidence to do the work if it was presented clearly enough. The independent legal representation. The contract amendment Audrey had requested and received. The time-stamped records of the price contact and refusal. The voluntary erasure of the debt, $7 million, surrendered without legal obligation, without court order, without negotiation. The Pembroke's argument requires you to believe, Voss said, that a man who voluntarily surrenders his single, most powerful piece of leverage in the middle of a lawsuit filed against him did so as part of a conspiracy. Ask yourself what conspiracy requires that. Ask yourself what kind of strategist gives away his strongest position, not in exchange for anything, not for a settlement, not for a legal advantage, not for anything at all, but simply because he decided to. He paused. People do inexplicable things for one reason consistently across human history, he said. Not strategy, not calculation, not conspiracy. He let the pause sit. They do it because someone matters to them more than winning does. He sat down 41 minutes and 13 seconds. Audrey had been counting. The jury was out for 4 hours and 20 minutes. She spent them in the conference room with Marjorie, not working because there was nothing left to work on. They drank coffee and talked about Marjorie's daughter, who was applying to undergraduate programs, and about a property case Audrey was studying in school, assignment, and about the specific psychological experience of waiting for a verdict that would determine the shape of the next several years of your life. Damon came in at the 2-hour mark and sat at the far end of the table and read something on his phone and said nothing. His presence was not intrusive. It was the presence of someone who had decided to be in the room and had no agenda beyond that. At the 3-hour mark, he put his phone down. "If it goes wrong," he said. Not to anyone specifically, to the room. "The appeals process is already mapped. Voss has—" "It's not going to go wrong," Audrey said. He looked at her. "You don't know that." "No. But I know the foreman spent day 3 and day 4 taking notes on the documentary evidence and almost none on the emotional testimony. And I know that Price's credibility is gone. And I know that Voss's closing was the strongest argument in that room today." She held Damon's gaze. "It's not going to go wrong." He looked at her for a moment. "You've become very certain," he said. "I've become very informed," she said. "There's a difference. Certainty is a feeling. Informed is a position." Something moved in his expression, the almost smile. The one that had become, over months of living in close proximity to it, one of the things she would most reliably miss if it was no longer a regular feature of her life. "You're going to be a very good lawyer," he said. "I know," she said. He almost laughed. It was the closest she had heard him come to it. At 4 hours and 20 minutes, Marjorie's phone buzzed. She looked at it. "They're back," she said. The verdict was delivered at 3:47 in the afternoon. A sound like green wood splitting, the foreperson was a woman in her 50s who read the finding with the steady composure of someone who had done her job carefully and was not interested in theater. Defendant finds for the defense all counts. Lawsuit dismissed. The courtroom produced a sound that was not quite noise and not quite silence, the specific acoustic signature of 200 people processing an outcome simultaneously. Audrey sat at the table and did not move for approximately 3 seconds. Then Marjorie put a hand on her shoulder and said, "Done," quietly, and Audrey exhaled the breath she had apparently been holding since 8:15 that morning. She turned to look at Damon. He was already looking. Voss was saying something to him and he was nodding, but he was looking at her with the expression that had no adequate name and that she had stopped trying to name and had simply started recognizing as the specific way. He looked at her and at nothing else in the world. She looked back at him for a moment. Then she looked at the gallery's front row. Constance Pembroke was sitting very still, with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged into something that had no performance left in it. It was the face of a woman who had lost something. She had been certain of not the lawsuit specifically, but the certainty itself. The architecture of control she had for 40 years and deployed so consistently that she had stopped distinguishing it from reality. Audrey looked at her for one more second. She felt nothing that resembled triumph. She had expected triumph. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complete, the specific resolution of finishing something that had required her full weight for a long time. She looked away. Outside the courtroom, in the marble hallway with cameras and reporters pressing against the barriers that the building's security had established, Voss made a brief statement. Concise, professional, without editorial. The lawsuit had been dismissed. The defendants were grateful for the jury's careful consideration. No further comment at this time. Audrey stood beside Damon in the hallway and watched Voss deliver the statement and felt the February cold coming through the building's entrance doors every time they opened. And she thought about the fact that she had walked into this building this morning as a defendant and was walking out as what, exactly? As herself. That was the closest she could get. As someone who had walked into something she didn't fully understand and had come out the other side understanding it completely, including the parts that were hard, and the parts that were unresolved, and the parts that were genuinely, irreducibly good. Grayson called her that evening. She was in the penthouse, in the kitchen, eating soup she had made herself, because she had needed the specific meditative activity of chopping vegetables and watching something simple transform into something nourishing. Damon was somewhere else in the apartment. She could hear the quiet presence of him, the particular acoustic signature of a person in the same building, which she had become so accustomed to over months, that its absence was now the thing that would feel strange. She looked at the screen. She answered, "Audrey." His voice had the quality of someone who had been working up to a call for a long time and had finally made it, and was not entirely sure what came after that. "I saw the verdict." "Okay," she said. "I wanted to. I owe you more than I've said." A pause. "I owe you the real version of what happened, not the version I gave you at the fundraiser." She sat down at the counter. "My mother didn't just threaten to cut me off," he said. She told me specifically that if I married you, she would spend whatever she had to spend to make your life in this city impossible. Not just difficult, impossible." A pause, and I believed her. I had watched her do it to other people, and he stopped. "Instead of standing between you and that, I just stepped aside." Audrey was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "You knew?" I understood it better as time went on. She looked at her soup. "It doesn't change what happened, but I understand it." "Does it change? Are you angry at me?" She thought about it honestly. "I was," she said. "For a long time I was very angry. At the cathedral, at the fundraiser, for weeks after." She paused. "Now I think you did what you were capable of doing, and that it wasn't enough, and that you'll have to live with that, and so will I, and that's—" She searched for the word. "That's just the shape of it." He was quiet. "You seem different," he said. "I am different. Is it him?" She thought about that carefully, because it deserved a careful answer. "It's me," she said. "He gave me certain things that made it easier to be me. But the change is mine." She paused. "I was different before I met him. I just didn't know it yet." A long silence. "I'm taking the West Coast position," he said. "I leave in 2 weeks." "I know. I hope it's good for you." "I mean that, Grayson. I know you do." He paused. I'm glad it worked out. The trial. And the rest of it." "Thank you," she said. She ended the call and sat with her soup in the quiet kitchen and felt the conversation settle into its place in the larger structure of everything. Not a wound anymore, not a scar she needed to manage. Just something that had happened and been addressed and could now be left where it was. Damon appeared in the kitchen doorway. He took in the phone on the counter and her expression and made a quick, accurate read. "Grayson," he said. Not a question. "He's leaving for the West Coast." He called to, I think he needed to close something. Damon came in and moved to the coffee maker. "Did he?" "Yeah," she said. "He did." She watched him make coffee with the focused efficiency he brought to everything. "I told him the change in me was mine, not yours." He looked at her over his shoulder. "It is yours," he said. "I know, but I wanted him to hear it clearly." He turned back to the coffee maker. "You closed something too," he said. "Yes." He brought 2 mugs to the counter and sat across from her, and they drank coffee over her soup. And outside Chicago was doing what Chicago did in February, brutal and indifferent, and inside the kitchen was warm and quiet and entirely sufficient. 3 weeks after the verdict, attorney delivered a proposal to the city's housing authority. Audrey read the draft before it went out. He had asked her to not for approval, not for legal review, but because he wanted her to see it before it was public. The proposal was for the half-finished property on the north side, the one that had been sitting since the Pembroke development deal failed. 7 years of expensive inertia. The proposal converted the development into affordable housing. 112 units. Below market rate, structured on an income-tiered model that Audrey recognized as incorporating elements of a housing law case she had discussed with him 3 weeks prior. The financial modeling was sophisticated, and the projected returns were modest, and the covering letter stated plainly that the project was not primarily a financial vehicle. She read it twice. Then she looked up at him across the desk. "This is what you wanted to build," she said. 8 years ago, before everything got complicated." He held her gaze. "I'm building it now, with your own capital, yes. No investors, a pause, no misleading projections." She looked at him for a moment. It's a good project, she said. It's a start. He took the document back. There are others. If the model works. She went back to her studying. She was 3 weeks from end of semester exams, and Dr. Hart had set a paper on consequential damages that was going to require everything she had, and the housing proposal was going to the city whether or not she sat here processing it. And Damon was going to build what he was going to build, because that was who he was becoming, and she had watched the becoming happen. And it did not require her narration. But later, in the quiet of the evening, she sat on the terrace with the Chicago skyline, doing what it did at dusk, that particular layering of light that the city produced when the sun went down over the lake and threw it back in 17 different directions. And she thought about the 8-year gap between what Damon had wanted to build and what he was finally building. She thought about what it cost to sit with something undone for that long. She thought about her own $11,000 savings account and a law school letter in a bottom drawer, and the 3 years in a bottom drawer and 3 years of making herself smaller and found in the cathedral steps, and 45 seconds of crying before she looked up and found a stranger with gray eyes who offered her the most unusual exit she had ever been given. She thought about the fact that she was sitting on a terrace in a penthouse in Chicago in February, in the convenience she had bought with her own first stipend payment, watching a skyline she had grown up, seeing from a very different angle, and that the life she was inside was genuinely, measurably, and somewhat astonishingly hers. The terrace door opened. Damon came out with 2 glasses and sat in the chair beside her and handed her one without ceremony and looked at the skyline. They sat in the kind of quiet that had taken months to build, the quiet of 2 people who had been through enough together. That silence was no longer a gap to fill, but a thing that had its own weight and texture. The contract expires in 6 weeks, he said. I know. I told you I wanted to talk about after. You did. He held his glass and looked at the skyline. The light was going gold and then going gray, and the city was doing its relentless, indifferent thing below them. I don't want to use the proposal as leverage, he said. The housing project. I'm telling you about it because I want you to know. Not because I want you to. He stopped, restarted. I'm aware that I have a history of building situations where the terms seem straightforward and the actual structure is more complicated. I'm trying not to do that. She looked at him. I know, she said. I can tell the difference now. He looked at her then. What do you want, he asked. Not the contract version. Not what you agreed to. What do you actually want? She held her glass and thought about it with the honesty it deserved. She wanted to finish law school. That was the clearest and most unambiguous thing she had ever wanted, and it remained true in every version of every future she could map. She wanted to practice in a way that mattered: housing law, tenant rights, the architecture of agreements between people who didn't have equal footing. She had figured this out somewhere between the consequential damages paper and watching Damon's attorney draft the housing proposal, the convergence of her education and the world she had been living inside for almost a year. She wanted her own income, her own professional identity. She had these in progress, and she was going to complete them, regardless of what else was true. She wanted Dana to stop looking at her with the expression of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop, which was going to require time and demonstrated stability, neither of which could be rushed. And she wanted, this was the part that had taken the longest to locate and the shortest time to be certain of. Once she found it, she wanted to keep sitting on this terrace with this man in the specific quality of silence they had built together, and she wanted to see what he built next, and she wanted to see what he built next, and she wanted him to ask her what she thought about it. And she wanted the version of him that was building real things to be the version she knew for the rest of whatever came after. She said, I want to stay. He was very still. Not because of the contract, she said. Not because of the trial, or the housing project, or what happened at the cathedral, or any of the reasons this started. Because I want to. She looked at him directly. That's all. That's the whole answer. He put his glass down on the terrace railing. Then he looked at her with the expression she had finally stopped trying to name and had simply accepted as the face of someone who had been given something they weren't entirely sure they deserved and were going to spend a considerable amount of time making sure they merited it. Okay, he said. Quiet, the quietest she had heard from him. Okay, she said. On a Thursday morning in April, Audrey Bellamy Vercetti sat in Dr. Hart's office and received a grade of exceptional on her consequential damages paper, along with a comment written in Dr. Hart's precise hand that said, "The argument in Section 3 is the clearest statement of efficient breach theory I've read from a first-year student. Consider this area seriously." She walked out of the law building into April air that had finally, after a Chicago winter that had lasted several weeks longer than it had any right to, turned warm enough to be worn without a coat. She stood on the steps and looked at the street and called, "Dana." "Grade came back," she said. Dana's response was immediate and unrestrained, and lasted approximately 30 seconds, during which Audrey held the phone away from her ear and smiled at the middle distance. "I knew," Dana said, finally, at a volume that was human. "I told you. I told you when you got in. You told me when I signed the contract with a Mafia boss. I told you that you were capable of handling it, which is basically the same thing." A pause. "How's everything else?" Audrey looked at the street. A woman was walking a dog that was clearly walking her. A man on a bicycle cut through the intersection at a speed that suggested complete confidence in his own invulnerability. Two students walked past, arguing about something, with the passionate conviction of people for whom the argument was the point. "Everything else is good," she said. "Yeah? Yeah." She meant it the way she had been learning to mean things specifically, without hedging. "He submitted the housing project proposal. The city's reviewing it. I saw. It's all over the local news." A pause. "He's really doing it. He's really doing it." Dana was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about him," she said. "In the beginning. I thought he was—" "You thought what made sense to think," Audrey said. "Given what you knew, are you going to stay?" "Yes." "Okay." She could hear Dana smiling. "Okay, good." She hung up and walked to her car and drove home through April Chicago, with the windows down, and the city doing its seething around her, indifferent and enormous and entirely uninterested in her personal narrative, which was exactly what she had always wanted from it. The contract's official expiration date was a Tuesday in May. Damon had not mentioned it as the date approached. Neither had she. It existed in the background of their shared days the way significant dates do when you have both agreed, without discussion, that the date itself is not the point. On the Sunday before, she found him in the study, not his study. The smaller one off the main hallway, the one she had colonized with her law textbooks in the first weeks, and that had gradually, incrementally, over the course of months, become simply a room they both used. Her books on the chair by the window, his reading at the desk, the specific, comfortable territorial overlap of people who have stopped dividing space and simply inhabit it. He was looking at something on his laptop that he closed when she came in, not with the guilty efficiency of someone hiding something, but with the ordinary consideration of someone finishing a thought before giving attention to something else. "The city came back on the housing proposal," he said. She sat in the chair by the window, and they want modifications to the income tiering model. 2 of the units need to be reserved differently under the municipal housing code. He leaned back. "It's fixable. Voss is on it. What kind of modifications?" He turned the laptop toward her. She read the city's response, which was 3 pages of specific, navigable administrative requirements, none of which were deal breakers and some of which were, she noted, directly addressed by a housing law case she had studied in February. "Section 2, she said. "The tiering formula, there's a case from 2019 that establishes as a model the city's already approved in 2 other developments. It's cleaner than what you've currently got, and it satisfies the municipal code requirement without restructuring the whole income model." He looked at her. "Do you have the case? I'll send it to you." She settled back in the chair. Voss should be able to work with it. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she knew, and had names for now, all of them inadequate, and all of them approximately right. Expression that said she had surprised him again, which happened less frequently than it used to, because he had adjusted his expectations in an upward direction. But that still happened regularly enough to tell her something she found important. "You're going to specialize in housing law," he said. "I think so." She looked at the skyline through the study window. "It's where the contract issues are most human. You can see exactly where the power imbalance is and exactly where the law has tools to address it. She paused. And where it doesn't. And you want to build the tools it doesn't have. Eventually. First I have to finish school and pass the bar and practice for a few years under someone who's been doing it longer than me. She looked at him. I have a plan. I know you do. He said it the way he had learned to say things about her without qualification, without the modified surprise he'd started with. Just as a fact about her. She sat with her book, and he returned to his work, and the study held them both in its ordinary, unremarkable, completely sufficient way. On the Tuesday the contract expired, they were both home. Not because of the date. Because it was a Tuesday and she had an afternoon seminar canceled, and he had moved a meeting to the morning, and neither of them had engineered it to mean anything in particular. The day simply landed the way days do when you have stopped forcing them into significance. They ate dinner in the kitchen. She had cooked not because it was the contract's last day, and some gesture was required, but because she had found a recipe she wanted to try, and Tuesday was as good a day as any. He had opened wine without being asked, and set the table with the efficient domesticity that she had come to find, without ever quite deciding to, deeply comfortable. They ate and talked about the housing case, and about a contracts professor who had announced a guest lecture series that Audrey was planning to attend, and about a complication in one of his legitimate development projects in the South Loop, that he walked her through in enough detail that she could actually follow the structural problem. After dinner she washed up and he dried, which was a division of labor that had arrived gradually and without negotiation, and outside the kitchen windows, Chicago was doing the thing it did in May, when the weather finally meant it soft and dark and almost gentle. She handed him a wet bowl. He dried it. It expired today, she said. Not dramatically, just noting it. He put the bowl away. I know, he said. She handed him another. He dried it. Put it away. Do you have the ring? She asked. He went still. Then he turned to look at her. She looked back at him with the particular steadiness she had acquired over a year of living inside, something she hadn't chosen and had built anyway from materials she hadn't known she had. He put down the dish towel. He left the kitchen for approximately 90 seconds. She finished the dishes. She was drying her hands on the dish towel when he came back. He stood across the kitchen from her. He was holding a ring box. Not the box from the original contract wedding. A different one, smaller, darker, the kind of box that held something chosen rather than arranged. She looked at it. She looked at him. Sopped. He crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, not the 4 in the morning version, not the verdict version, but something further and quieter than either of those. The expression of a man who had spent his entire adult life constructing situations where the outcome was controllable and had arrived at the one situation he had no architecture for. He opened the box. The ring was simple. A single stone, not ostentatious, not designed to perform wealth. Designed to last. Audrey Bellamy Vercetti, he said. His voice was completely even and completely unsteady at the same time, which should not have been possible, and was the most honest thing she had ever heard from him. Will you stay married to me? Because you choose to. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought very briefly about the woman who had sat on cathedral steps in a torn dress with 45 seconds of privacy before Dana came through the doors, and who had looked up at a stranger and made a decision that was equal parts desperation and instinct, and something she had not had a name for until much later. She had been trying to survive. She had been trying to find a floor to stand on. She had found one. And then she had built the rest herself, from the ground up, with her own hands, in her own time, in the specific increments that were hers to control. The man in front of her had given her certain things, the financial foundation, the legal protection, the first confrontation with Constance Pembroke that had cracked open a space she didn't know she needed. He had given her room to become what she already was. The rest had been her. That was the part she needed to be clear about to herself before she answered. Not because his contribution was small, because hers was real. Yes, she said. He put the ring on her finger and she let him, and she looked at it for a moment, at the ring that replaced the contract ring, at the finger it sat on, at her own hand that had signed 40 pages of legal document on the kitchen counter of a penthouse she'd never been in and had come to inhabit and had come to call home without ever quite choosing the moment she did. She looked up at him. He was looking at her the way she now understood. He looked at things he intended to keep, with the steady, undemonstrative attention of someone who did not take ongoing presence for granted. She put her free hand against his chest. His heartbeat was not steady. She felt that clearly and found it, in the way she found most of his involuntary honesty, deeply reassuring. He put his hand over hers. Outside, Chicago went on in its enormous indifferent way, and the skyline did what it did in May, and the lake was out there in the dark doing what lakes do when nobody is watching them, and none of it paused, or softened, or arranged itself around the moment in the kitchen, because the city had never been interested in their story. The story had happened anyway, not cleanly, not smoothly. A sound like green wood splitting, not according to any plan either of them had made standing on the Kinstfest October with a torn dress and a business proposition and approximately no idea what they were actually beginning. It had happened in document exchanges, and overcooked eggs and 4 in the morning honesty, and a lawsuit that had required everything they had, and a ring box from a man who had spent his whole life managing outcomes, and had finally, standing in a kitchen with a dish towel on the counter, let one go entirely unmanaged. Audrey Bellamy had gone looking for a floor to stand on. She had built something worth standing on. And the man beside her, who was not harmless, who had made real mistakes, with real consequences, who was still in the process of becoming the person his best decisions pointed toward, was in the business of building things too. They were, it turned out, well matched for that.